Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Evelyn was even more interested in Brandon Locke. The reason why she accepted such a ridiculous exchange was because he seemed to know more than he let out. She wanted to ask him what exactly is Amy's involvement in the entire ordeal. Why was she kidnapped? Why did the Osborns target her? But due to his relentless no questions asked, she decided to let it slide. For now, everything would start to make sense if she sticks close to him. But she was quite taken aback as well when he asked her to help him save Amy. It meant that he harbored no ill will towards Amy. So someone that wanted to save her should have no such intentions. Still, isn't he way too used to dealing with women? From the way he spoke to the girl with the ponytail, to the princess Carrie with Amy. Now she was on a motorcycle, embracing the said person from the back. For some reason, Brandon was way too involved with women. Is he a womanizer by chance? The type of person she detests the most. But she instantly snapped out her thoughts. She realized Brandon was quite nonchalant when he dealt with women, as if he didn't actually care. But Evelyn couldn't trust him yet. As long as she sticks to him, she'll eventually find out what kind of man Brandon Locke was. But at the moment, Brandon Locke was suspicious. Vroom! The two had finally arrived at the Osborn Company building. The building stood tall. Gazing above, Brandon could tell that there were several floors, while the top floor should be the CEO's office. Yet for some reason, all the lights are off. From his side, Evelyn chimed in. They must have abandoned it. To his surprise, it seemed like Osborn didn't plan a trap or some sort as the building was entirely abandoned. It made sense. After the kidnapping, once again, it immediately made the headlines. After all, the person that was kidnapped in question was Amy Ashfield, a student of Astrea Academy and the heir to the Ashfield Company. It was immediately ruled out that Osborn Company was involved, or rather, the culprit in question. Most of the investors pulled out their investments, and the company was soon to become bankrupt. Despite protecting Amy inconspicuously through Alpha, she was kidnapped anyway. This frustrated Brandon. He had never expected Osborn to do the deed during the battle royale. Why? Were they abandoning everything? He didn't know. Everything is my fault. It all started when he killed Felix. Regardless, it had already happened, and the next thing to do was to save Amy. Truthfully, he didn't even know if Amy was still alive. But she had to be. As long as she didn't tell Osborn who the perpetrator was, she might be left alive. She was the only witness after all. Osborn couldn't lose such a valuable hostage. Striding towards the entrance, it seemed like the door was locked. Brandon lifted his palm. Phoo! A gust of wind blew the door open. As they entered the building, what met their sight was nothing but darkness. It seemed like the building really was abandoned. From behind him, Evelyn conjured a bright golden light that illuminated the entire place. So this is celestial magic. Brandon was left in a daze as he stared at the light, but then immediately snapped out of it and scanned his surroundings. Everything seemed to be right in place. There was no damage of any kind. From a distance, they could see the elevator, but as he thoroughly scanned it, the number of the floors didn't appear. In other words, it wasn't working. So, we have to take the stairs. Evelyn walked ahead of him towards the spiral staircase. Nope, let's head back outside. Why? You'll see. At her instructions, the two immediately beckoned outside the building. Stand back. Brandon did just that and fixed his gaze on Evelyn, who stood in front of him. She clasped her hands together and, instantly, a pair of radiant golden wings materialized behind Evelyn. The wings seemed to home behind her as it wasn't directly attached to it. But regardless, Evelyn started floating. She then offered her hand to Brandon, who was reluctant in accepting it. Take my hand. But regardless, Brandon accepted the gesture and grabbed Evelyn's hand. As they made their way up towards the final floor, with a flick of Evelyn's finger, radiant yellow orbs materialized and immediately shattered the window. At that, they entered what seems to be the CEO's office. Once again, it was abandoned. The whole room was dark, and the only thing that illuminated it was the moonlight. Snap! With a flick of her finger, Evelyn conjured a bright golden orb and immediately illuminated the entire office. Brandon then scanned the entire room. The entire place was well furnished. Despite the building being abandoned, most of the furniture was left exactly as how it was supposed to be. Truth be told, Brandon didn't know what he was supposed to be looking for, and it seemed like Evelyn noticed he was at a loss as she asked, "So, what do we do next?" Brandon pondered for a while. He shifted his attention to the papers on the floor. He then realized they were documents. But what kind? He didn't know. Regardless, he made a stride towards it. Step, step. Behind him, Evelyn sat down on the couch. It seemed like she wanted him to do all the work. So that's why she asked me to be her protege. A plausible theory. I shouldn't have agreed. He felt like he would have his work cut out for him. But he dismissed his thoughts as he peered down on the paper strewn before him. At that, accelerated cognition. His thoughts became clear. Calm. Steady. Colors drained. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. His entire focus. The words on the paper. The entire document. In a second. Next document. And the next. Again. And again. And again. In a minute, he had finished reading all the documents word per word. Through his findings, each document's contents were quite different. But what caught his attention was where the assets were being spent on. There were buildings that they've seemingly bought out. But one small detail was all he needed to conclude where Amy was being held. From all the buildings they've bought, there was one where they decided to construct themselves. Brandon could more or less guess this because the document had the cost of materials for construction. Yet, isn't this way too obvious? The documents were strewn all over the floor, as if it was meant to be found in the first place. If Osborne had already abandoned everything, then why would clumsily leave such an important lead? He was grasping for straws. However, his uncertainty dictated his next course of action. Brandon abruptly stood up and turned around to glance at Evelyn, who was slurp. Once again, slurp, slurp, shoving a lollipop in her mouth. What? Miss Evelyn? Yes. I think I know where they are. But I'm unsure, so I think we should split up. Okay. Where do you need me to go? At that, Brandon informed her about his findings. He then instructed her to check 20 different buildings, while Brandon would check the one that the Osborne Company constructed. Before Evelyn left, she turned to glance at Brandon and gave him a nod. Brandon nodded in return. With that, Evelyn flew off. Brandon's next course of action was to look for whatever details were inside the building. He couldn't come in there blind. He then motioned towards the drawers. But before he did, thump, thump, thump. The sound of footsteps reached his ears. Not just one, but a lot. At that moment, Brandon immediately retrieved the Mirage mask from his inventory and donned it. Since Evelyn had already left, it was safe to do so. Bang! The door smacked open. A familiar figure emerged. Brandon's eyes shot wide open, though the figure wouldn't be able to see it as he donned the mask. It was none other than the main protagonist, Raven Blackheart, adorning the Special Force uniform. And from behind Raven were a bunch of members from the Special Force as well. When Brandon locked eyes with him, Raven's eyes shot wide open as well. You, don't move. Is that him? The masked man. Step. Brandon stepped back. Stop. I said don't move. One of the officers lifted their hand to conjure up whatever skill they planned on using. But once again, nothing happened. What? What's wrong? Step. The mana. It disappeared. How was that possible? Another officer lifted their hand as well. Yet nothing happened. Step. After him. A woman strode forward, with pale wheat hair and blue eyes. Catch me if you can. After muttering those words, Brandon jumped back. Stop. Raven's voice reached him. With Brandon's front face towards them, he jumped backwards and fell from the window. Sherlock! Sherlock! After the masked man jumped from the window, Raven immediately ran and peered down the window to seek out any traces of the man, only to find nothing. The masked man disappeared, and he was left grasping for straws. Who? Sherlock. How does he know that? These questions flooded his mind, but no matter how much he asked himself, he knew there was no answer to it. There was no one else who knew the Sherlock moniker besides a task force member. This doesn't make any sense. Raven grumbled. He tried to shadow step to the masked man's shadow, yet for some reason it was canceled out, as if the mana he tried to conjure had dissipated. And it seemed like he wasn't the only one confused by this, as he turned around to look at his comrades, who wore looks of shock and disbelief. Silence. None of them could comprehend what had just happened. Not even Raven, who had the skill and venom mind and contract expertise, skills that directly boosted his mental facilities. The moment he tried to step inside the masked man's shadow, to his surprise, his skill didn't work. No, not his skill, but he couldn't feel any mana at all. Despite having eye of time, all he could do was watch the entire scene unfold as the masked man leapt out of the building. Tis! He clicked his tongue as he clenched his teeth in frustration. The sheer fact that he did not have any ounce of an idea on the masked man's identity had left him frustrated. For the first time, not Raven, but Sherlock had felt so defeated. He then realized just how dire the entire situation was. It was out of his hands, but just as he was about to despair, a hand reached out for him and touched his shoulder. Turning around, it was Reyna, who wore looks of frustration as well. That man. Yeah, it's him, isn't it? The descriptions that Amy gave fit exactly with the masked man's features. A white mask with blue runic symbols etched onto it and pale white hair. For some reason, the man's hair looked familiar, yet at the same time, he couldn't put a finger on it, as if an opposite force was keeping him from deducing the man's identity. He clenched his teeth once again. The fact that the man appeared in the building on just the same day Amy was kidnapped was suspicious, as if he knew what had just happened to Amy. Was he working for the Osborns? No, that wouldn't make sense, as he was the perpetrator for Felix's death. So who? Who could that man be? They had no lead on him, and it seemed like they would be overpowered by him as well. That fact alone left Raven disheartened. After all, the Special Force was by no means a weak group. He felt Reyna remove her hand from his shoulder. She looked at her hand, and she pursed her lips. My magic, it wouldn't work against him. I've never felt anything like that before. I know. I couldn't conjure my mana either. As soon as I started to feel my mana, it felt like it dispersed just as I tried to shape it. Reyna breathed out a heavy sigh as she pursed her lips again and continued. This is more complicated than we thought. It is. As Raven motioned to walk towards the group, he realized he stepped on something peculiar. Glancing down, it seemed to be a document of some sort. He leaned down to pick it up and read the contents of the document. Then his eyes shot wide open in surprise. This. He then shifted his gaze from the document to the group, who seemed to be engrossed by the paper strewn on the floor. Everyone. They all turned to look at him. I have a lead. Ring, ring, ring. Tis, what's going on with him? Once again, Alpha wasn't picking up his calls. Vroom. Brandon continued to traverse the streets on his motorcycle. The moonlight was drowned out by the light of the buildings and street lamps. He continued to swiftly maneuver between cars. There was no time to waste as he ignored the red light signal from the traffic lights. Vroom. From his findings, the location seemed to be a hotel, though it was not constructed under the Osborn Company name. In other words, it was a ghost company. They seemed to have dodged all legality as the hotel was open for operations. Of course, there were other buildings that belonged to the company, but Evelyn was already headed there. If she somehow finds Osborn, then the situation would easily be dealt with, which is why he had asked her to go to all the other buildings, while he would only go to one. It was a win-win situation. If Evelyn would eventually find them, then he didn't have to do anything. But Brandon was quite uneasy. He wasn't confident if he could actually beat a Wraithbound, and he was quite surprised that Raven and the Special Force suddenly appeared back in the Osborn Company building. But at that moment, he was able to come up with a plan. Truth be told, he didn't plan on using mana disruption, but it seemed like Reyna was about to attack him. Though, he wouldn't mind it, as he could just dodge her attack. However, from what he remembered from the novel, Reyna was a mage with the fire affinity. If Brandon allowed her to conjure up her flames, there was a high possibility that the documents would burn in the process. The moment he stepped back and seemingly stared at the group was when he inconspicuously dropped the document. The exact same document with the details of the hotel's construction and location. He left it there on purpose. In other words, he was counting on Raven to deduce where he, or specifically Moriarty, was planning on going next. The plan was risky. If he somehow slips up, then there was no doubt that he would be arrested. I do hope Evelyn makes it in time before they arrive. It was a contingency plan, but if it all works out, then he wouldn't have to do anything to reap the rewards of the quest and save Amy in the process. Phew, vroom. But what he was in fact sure of was that Amy was still alive. He had several theories on what the Osborns were planning for Amy, to either lure Moriarty out or to turn Amy into a wraithbound. He was unsure, but it was a possibility. But what he was in fact sure of was that Amy was still alive. She has to be. From this going forward, it would be all up to Amy if her will is strong enough to not accept the pact. Skill tab. Skill tab. Accelerated cognition. End of proof timer, 10 minutes. End of proof, cooldown left, 43 minutes. I just hope Amy didn't tell him anything about me. Telling whichever Osborn is with her about Moriarty was fine. But if she said anything specific about seeing Brandon Locke that night would be quite troublesome. In other words, Brandon Locke would become a target for the Wraithbounds. He could definitely feel panic starting to rise within him, but he had to compose himself. Now, he was in a race with time. All the pieces were already set in place accordingly. All he had to do was play the next move correctly. Phew, vroom, I'm in the last building. So far, I haven't seen Amy or Osborn. Also, most of the businesses seem to be shut down. I see. Can you come to the hotel now? Do you think they're there? Most likely. It's the only business they have that's still resuming operations. Isn't that way too obvious? It is. Then what makes you so sure they are there? Eyes. What? I've yet to step foot on the building, but it feels like all eyes are on me. Elaborate? The guards, the guests. They're trying to hide it, but they've been sneaking glances on me from time to time. Isn't it because of your looks? Miss Evelyn, are you saying it's because your assistant is handsome? What? And no. What made you even think that? Huh. I'll be there. Don't do anything stupid before I arrive. Sure. Click. Evelyn's hypothesis somehow made sense. But the way they're looking at me, there was a tinge of malice from their gaze. For Brandon, it felt suffocating. Regardless, he had to put the next phase of his plans in motion. To make Brandon Locke's alibi. If Evelyn meets up with Raven and the rest of the Special Force, she would most likely ask where Brandon was. He couldn't just disappear for no reason. It would raise Evelyn's suspicion. Not only that, but the mere mention of Brandon would raise Raven's suspicion as well. Raven would most likely think along the lines of, Brandon, he's here. It would eventually lead to Raven concluding that Brandon and Moriarty are one, regardless of having the Mirage mask or not. He couldn't let that happen. The first thing to do was to call the police and alert them of the situation. Any amount of reinforcement was welcome, and it was a good alibi. Ring, ring, click. As the call connected, Brandon put on his best victim impression, making his voice shaky. Good evening, this is District 811. How can we? Please help me. Click. Those were all the words he needed to say. The police should understand the urgency of the situation just from those last chilling words. Step. He continued forward. The entrance of the hotel a few distance from him. In front of him seemed to be two guards who stood by the entrance on both sides. Don't do something stupid. He was going to do exactly that. As he continued forward, he felt the gaze of the guards on him. Face to face with them, one of the guards spoke up. Halt! This is an invite-only hotel, name? Name? There was no point in trying to mask his identity. If he had a strike, now was the best time. If he entered the hotel and started the attack there, he would be surrounded from all sides. Moriarty. He smirked. You're not on the guest lease, uck. Before the guard finished, Brandon stuck an ice dagger that was hidden beneath his sleeve on the guard's throat. They weren't wraithbounds, so it was a quick kill. You have slain a human. Plus 5 EXP. In true uck. TSZZ. Brandon instantly flashed in front of the other guard, leaving trails of blue sparks, and slit his throat with the ice dagger. Silence. Despite the amount of guests inside the building, none of them reacted to what had just happened. No screams, no gasps, nothing. All they did was continue to stare at him. As expected, this is the place. There was no need to delay the inevitable. They were all going to die. Step. As he stepped inside, all eyes were on him. Brandon felt a chill down his spine at the creepy stairs. One of the guests lifted their hand. Noticing this, Brandon instantly disrupted the mana. Huh, what are you doing? Chain him up now. Chain? So they had mana shackles, huh? At that, a myriad of ice spears materialized behind Brandon. CR. Crack. With a motion of his hand down, the spears turned to rain down on the guests. Screams echoed throughout the entire lobby, as the entire building shook in chaos. Some tried to fend them off, while some tried to flee. But no one will be spared. An ice chain protruded from the ground and pierced through the air, interlocking with all the guests that tried to flee. From behind him, a wind vortex seemingly tried to reel them in. But Brandon flashed forward inside the vortex, leaving a trail of blue sparks. Inside the vortex, he spun around with wind magic boosting his speed. As he did that, the wind dispersed, and he once again flashed forward towards the guest that conjured it. Fuck, he's a Devia, uck. Spurt. An ice sword materialized from Brandon's hand and instantly slashed at the man. Sparks of magic continued to pierce through the air from all sides. Brandon would narrowly dodge while some would land hit. There was too much for mana disruption to be effective. Yet despite that, whenever he had the chance to, he would disrupt at least one mage's mana. Easy boom. A bolt of lightning struck Brandon as he crashed down on the ground. Yucca! He spat out blood. Despite increasing his def stat, it still wasn't enough to mitigate the damage. Brandon slowly got up as another barrage of magic was headed towards him. Tis! He clicked his tongue. There were too many mages for him to take on at once. Should I have waited for Evelyn? No. He dismissed his thoughts. He knew that if he did that, he wouldn't be able to cover his tracks. A day will come when they would conclude that he was Moriarty. He can't allow it to happen. TSZZ. He continued to dodge each magic strike. But yet again, some would pass his defense and the magic would strike him. Lightning would pierce through his torso while gusts of wind would blow him, sending him hurling away. Brandon skidded back several meters. TSZZ. Regardless, he pushed forward, with lightning magic enhancing his speed and wind magic directly boosting the swing of his ice sword. Slash! For every mage he killed, magic skills would pierce through the air and strike him whenever there was an opening. Huh! Huh! Suddenly, he felt his breath grow heavy. He suddenly felt like he was tired. Huh! It amused him. It was the result of overuse of magic skills without any proper mana training. However, there were only a few mages left. He just had to push through. Until they were all dead. TSZZ. You have slain a human. You have slain a human. You have slain a human. You have leveled up. Stat points, +3. Skill Weaver capacity has increased. You have unlocked the water affinity. At the end of it all, Brandon slumped down and leaned his back on a pillar. Huh, huh. He took deep, heavy breaths, and his vision started to get hazy. Drip, drip. He lifted his hand to touch his forehead and felt an eerie, wet sensation. Lifting it down, it was a familiar sight. Blood. His forehead had started bleeding as blood continued to drip down, covering his eye. Ha! All Brandon could do was laugh at his pathetic state. Though things didn't go quite as planned, what mattered to him were the results. Of course, he could just buy healing potions from the system shop and instantly heal his injuries. But he opted not to. The fact that he was severely injured would greatly increase the chances of his plan to work. That was because, this is even better than I expected. The fact that he was severely injured would greatly increase the chances of his plan to work. Huh. Once again, he took a deep, heavy breath. He turned to scan the room, despite his vision getting blurry. Blood stained the walls. Several debris scattered on the ground. All the furniture was torn. And mages lay dead on the ground. Some were gruesomely split apart, while some had ice spears impaled deeply on their bodies. All because of one man, Brandon Locke. He could tell that his opponents weren't really seasoned mages. It was just that there were too many of them. But he could tell they were a lot stronger than the mages he had beaten during the Battle Royale. From a distance, the sound of sirens reached his ears. Whew, whew. He turned his gaze to the window and realized that the police had finally arrived. Slam! The glass door abruptly slammed open, and several figures emerged at the entrance. Wheel, wheel. Arriving at the hotel, Raven, Reyna, and the rest of Special Force quickly made it onto the scene. What met their sight was a crowd of police. Police cars encircled the entire area, their sirens echoing throughout the street, while the rest of the police officers hid behind the cars, peering at the entrance. It seemed like they were waiting for more reinforcements. At that, Raven turned his gaze to the hotel. Scanning the entrance, there were 2 guards that laid on the ground dead. The hotel's window had several cracks while blood splattered the entire window. No wonder they didn't rush inside. It was a gruesome sight. Whatever happened inside would terrify even Raven. But regardless, this was his job, or rather, the job of a future Special Force member. He then switched his gaze to an officer who seemed to be on standby. For some reason, the officers had arrived at the scene before them. Did someone tip them off? He had to ask. You. The officer was jolted, turning around to meet Raven's eyes. Ah, a Special Force officer. I'm so glad all of you are here. MHM, what's the situation? We've received a call for help in this location. Yet we couldn't see where the caller was. Have you traced the number? Yes, the number belongs to a Brandon lock. Instantly, Raven bolted past the officer, shoving him to the side. Hey, Shirley, where are you going? Raina's voice reached him, but Raven paid no heed to it, letting out the other ear. Brandon, he knew Brandon's personality. He'd seen it during their fight. Despite the stoic personality Brandon had recently shown, Raven could see it in his eyes. After all, they were the same. They were both battle maniacs, and Brandon seemed to be the one to call the police. That meant Brandon was inside the hotel. There was no doubt within Raven's mind. Slam! The door abruptly opened, and the rest of the Special Force members followed him. What met their sight was chaos. What the fuck happened here? Drake walked ahead, scanning the entire lobby. The entire lobby was a bloodbath. Mages lay dead on the ground. Some were torn in half, while some seemed to be struck with ice spears. There seemed to be bodies that were burnt as well. But despite the gruesome sight, what caught Raven's attention was a familiar figure that lay on a broken pillar, the figure's back leaning on it. At that moment, Raven abruptly rushed towards the seemingly unconscious Brandon. Brandon, hey, don't forget the protocols. Raina's voice once again. Yet Raven paid no heed to it once more. His friend was in a critical situation. Bah, thump, bah, thump. Raven could feel his heart race in the off chance that Brandon was dead. As he made his way towards the unconscious Brandon, the first thing he did was gave Brandon's face a slap. Tack, tack. Hey, Brandon. Drake seemed to have followed him, ignoring the protocols as well. You know this kid? He's my friend. Drake didn't pursue the matter. He seemed to have taken the hint that Raven was not in the right state of mind since Brandon was in a dire state. From behind Raven, someone placed their hand on his shoulder, and her voice reached him. Move. It was Alexandra. Her blue eyes stared deep within his. At her instructions, Raven pulled away from Brandon. Then, Alexandra kneeled down before Brandon, placing both of her palms on Brandon's chest. Suddenly, a bright hollow light emerged from her palms. At that moment, most of Brandon's minor injuries started to disappear. This was possible because Alexandra was a mage of a special affinity. Life. She had the abilities to heal most injuries instantly. While major injuries took quite a while and a lot of mana, this power made her eligible to join the Special Force. Each and every one of the Special Force had special affinities, while some of them were deviants. The reason for this was due to the qualifications of being a Special Force member. Raven was scouted due to his astonishing deductive skills and his special affinity. Shadow. After Brandon was healed, his eyes gradually twitched. He then woke up, slowly opening his eyes. Hua! As he opened his eyes, what met his blurry sight were several figures encircling him. Brandon, ah! To his surprise, Raven had already arrived, giving him a worried look. Brandon, can you hear me? Yes. Raven then nodded and lifted his hand up, flexing 2 of his fingers. Seriously? Okay, it seems like you're fine. Brandon then scanned the rest of the figures surrounding him. What caught his attention was a beautiful woman with pale wheat hair and dark eyes. Reina, huh? The descriptions from the Path to Ascension novel were accurate. He was familiar with her features since. Reina was his favorite character. Not realizing that he was staring at her, Reina pursed her lips and said, "Kid, we've got a lot of questions for you. But for now, go recuperate. There are ambulances outside. Leave the rest to us." Okay. Raven seemed like he didn't listen to Reina at all as he asked Brandon with a worried tone. "Brandon, why are you here? How did you even know this place?" "To save Amy." Raven's eyes shot wide open. This was the perfect chance to clear any connection between him and Moriarty. "Me and Miss Evelyn are working together to save Amy." He had to mention her. After all, Reina and Evelyn were guildmates, the latter being the superior. "Miss Evelyn, she's here." Reina's voice raised loudly. "No, but she's coming." "I see. But what happened here?" Reina tilted her head. She seemed to have forgotten her protocols as well. Though it didn't matter. It would save Brandon time. "I fought with all these mages and almost lost." Reina turned around to sneak a glance at the area, then turned back around and looked at Brandon. "So you're saying you killed everyone here?" "No, there was someone else. A masked man. I had to pretend to be dead, or he would have killed me as well." At that, Reina turned around once again and glanced at the officers. Their discussion reached Brandon's ears since they were quite close. "It's that man, isn't it? There's no one else." "Huh." They then once again glanced at Brandon. "Thank you for the tip. Please rest now and leave everything to us." Brandon then nodded at her words. Raven kneeled down and offered his shoulder. Brandon accepted the gesture as the two beckoned at the entrance. As they arrived at the entrance, a familiar figure once again emerged. Her long, dark, purple hair fluttered from the breeze, and the moonlight highlighted her flawless facial features. It was none other than Evelyn. After Evelyn arrived, Brandon was taken to a nearby ambulance that was parked outside. Brandon was seated on the ambulance's trunk while a nurse tended to his wounds. Evelyn, on the other hand, stood in front of Brandon, her hands placed on both sides of her waist as she knitted her brows. The nurse seemed to have recognized her as well, stealing quick glances at her. After all, Evelyn really was a popular mage in the country. It wouldn't be surprising if a regular citizen were to recognize her. "I told you not to do anything stupid until I arrive." In my defense, they were looking at me funny. "Aren't you used to being looked at by now? Are you implying that you tend to look at me?" What? And no, that's not what I... Huh. She breathed a heavy sigh, and as soon as she did, Brandon flashed her a sly smirk. The moment he did that, all of her worries had suddenly vanished. This cheeky brat. Truth be told, Evelyn was quite anxious when she was headed for the hotel. She wasn't particularly close with Brandon, and she barely knew his personality. Yet despite her warnings, she felt like Brandon would do something incredibly stupid. And he did just that. She redirected her attention to Brandon, who seemed to be lost in his thoughts. Evelyn flashed him a warm smile, then pursed her lips. "You may rest now. You've done your part. Leave everything to us." The moment those words left her mouth, she had thought that Brandon would once again give a witty remark or even retort. But to her surprise, he didn't and gave her a nod instead, flashing her a warm smile that mirrored her own. "Thanks." Evelyn was taken aback. Brandon was usually stoic and cold, as if nothing could faze him. Even with the whole situation of Amy's kidnapping, Brandon remained calm and composed. So he can make a face like that. After they finished their conversation, Evelyn left Brandon with the nurses and headed back inside the hotel. Stepping inside the lobby, it seemed like the special force officers were having their discussion as well. The first one to have noticed her entrance was Reina. Reina lowered her head, giving Evelyn a low bow. "Miss Evelyn, I'm so glad to have your assistance on this matter." When the two of them operated in the Waltz Guild, Reina would always give her this kind of mannerism as well. The reason for this was because Evelyn was Reina's senior and superior in the guild. While Reina was 21 years old, Evelyn was 25 years old. Despite not operating under the guild for the current operation, it seemed like Reina would still give her the proper courtesy anyway. Evelyn then nodded at Reina's gesture. She was quite fond of Reina. She would think of her like a cute junior that would always follow her around. But of course, this was out of the guild's jurisdiction. So Evelyn would have to follow the task force's proper protocols. Raina stepped forward to face Evelyn. She pursed her lips and said, "Miss Evelyn, allow me to introduce you to one of our members." The moment those words had left Raina's mouth, a tall man with red hair and blue eyes stepped forward. The man gave her a light bow as well. He then raised his head and locked eyes with Evelyn. "Greetings, Lady Evelyn. My name is Clint Stormfall, and I specialize in reconnaissance." Clint then looked above the ceiling, then redirected his gaze back to Evelyn and continued. "With my heat affinity, I can see the heat signature of anyone within a radius." Evelyn raised her brow. She knew that each member of the Special Force had unique special affinities, but it was quite surprising for her, as she has never met anyone with the heat affinity. Snapping her out of her thoughts, Clint continued. "Lady Evelyn, I heard you could fly. I can scan the rooms of this hotel easily if you were to take me with you." She hesitated. Evelyn didn't like the idea of holding a man's hand. Wait, a memory of Brandon holding her hand and ascending up the building from back then etched on her mind. "He's my assistant, protege." That's what she told herself. She snapped out her thoughts. She looked at Clint, who seemed to have noticed her reluctance of the whole idea. "If you're uncomfortable with it, then... No, it's a good plan." She abruptly cut him off. "Oh, okay." After coming to an agreement, the group beckoned outside the hotel. Evelyn shifted her gaze up. She got into a stance and waved her hand at the group. "Stand back." The group did just that, and the moment the group stood back, a pair of radiant golden wings materialized behind Evelyn. The shocks and awes coming from the Special Force and several other police officers behind Evelyn reached her ears. "Whoa, it's beautiful." So this is Lady Evelyn's famous celestial magic. Evelyn secretly grinned at the compliments. Celestial magic was her pride after all. Then she turned around to meet Clint's gaze. She gestured her hand for him to take it. "Let's go." Clint nodded at the gesture and took her hand. Phew. At that, the two instantly flew upwards. Evelyn gazed up while Clint was peering down. Evelyn took a quick glance at Clint, who she could feel was trembling. Is this man really a Special Force officer? But she paid it no mind and continued ascending upward. Evelyn then pursed her lips. "So, what can you see?" I can see several figures in each room. There are quite a lot of them." "Any signs of Amy?" "Not yet. Maybe at the top floor." Evelyn nodded and continued to ascend. As soon as she did, Clint stuck his other hand and pointed at a specific room from above. "I think I see them. There's one man in that room, and..." As Clint's next words left his mouth, seething rage welled up within Evelyn. "There's a girl, bound by chains." Evelyn clenched her hand that was holding Clint's hand tightly. She ascended the speed even more, the wind pressure fluttering her dark purple hair. However, before Evelyn could react, an ice arrow launched from a specific room and pierced through the air, shattering the window and striking Evelyn down. Though it pierced Evelyn, the arrow's mana was inefficient enough to actually damage her. There was a significant gap between the mage that conjured it and Evelyn. Yet despite that, it didn't mitigate the force of the impact as Evelyn was sent hurling down. Bracing for impact, Clint immediately called out to the rest of the Special Force officers from above. "They're on the top floor. Be careful, there are mages waiting for you." The officers immediately nodded and beckoned inside. Clint turned towards Evelyn, locking eyes with her. "Lady Evelyn, can you do something about this?" "Nope." "Wah." Though Evelyn can fly with her celestial wings, she can't control its trajectory once its gravity is shifted. Since the arrow struck her, the sheer force of the impact abruptly changed the wing's trajectory. Thus, crash. Fuck, why does it only have 36 floors available? Trying to make their way up the highest floor via the elevator, they paused abruptly just at the 36th floor. From what they knew about the hotel from the documents that Raven read, the hotel had a total of 50 floors. As the door gradually opened, what met their line of sight were sparks of magic hurling towards them. With shadow step, Raven narrowly dodged and appeared behind a mage, instantly slitting the mage's throat. The rest of the special force conjured a wall of flames, particularly Reyna. Though flames wasn't just any ordinary flames. They were holy flames. Reyna was nicknamed the Phoenix due to her special affinity. Holy, her flames could burn, yet they could also heal her. But it could only heal her alone. The form she currently took was a special ability that most mages with the special affinity had: elemental assimilation. They would become one with their evolved element. For the rest of her squad mates, "Ach, leader, it's way too hot." No complaints. As the flames dispersed, Reyna strode the hallways with poise regal. Holy flames erupted from her body, burning whatever poor mage it would find. Her pale wheat hair would continue to flutter, highlighting her flawless features. She didn't even lift a finger. All she did was walk, walk, and walk, and walk, with flames protruding from her body, like an incarnation of the phoenix itself. Are we even needed here? Her squad mates could only tilt their heads with an awkward expression. This kind of scene was quite familiar to them. It had happened more times than they could count, to the point where their old squad mates had left the group on their volition. They would leave with complaints along the lines of, "I didn't join this force just to become an extra." What special force? It's just Reyna and Reyna alone. Yeah, she was the it girl of the entire Special Force Division. The only reason this batch of officers decided to stay was because most of them had support skills, though they were competent in combat as well. They were all deviants, with only their special affinities leaning on the supportive side. Eek! One of the mages slumped down a corner with a fearful expression. Reyna leaned down in front of him and, smooch, she blew him a flying kiss. Holy flames left her moist lips and instantly burnt the mage, from his flesh down to the bones, until he was turned into nothing left but ashes. While she was dubbed the Phoenix to the public, the rest of the Special Force thought of her as something else. A sadist. Click, click. She continued to stride the hallways with regal. The sound of clicking from her heels reverberated the hallways, but would instantly be drowned out by the sound of screams and the burning of fire. This continued until the screams stopped. At that, Reyna single-handedly wiped out an entire group of mages that resided in the 36th floor. Licking her lips, she gradually dispersed the flames. She then scanned the entire hallway. Scorch marks etched the entire halls, while ashes were scattered everywhere. From behind, her squad mates had already dealt with the mages that seemed to have survived the ordeal, most likely by dodging or hiding. Good. She nodded at them, while they gave her looks of disgust, though she didn't mind it. They were squad mates that had stuck to her when all the others had left. It was then when she noticed a particular someone was missing. HM, has anyone seen Shirley? One of her squad mates, particularly Francine, pulled her sword free from a dead mage. Francine then looked around, moving her head from all sides, and abruptly landed her gaze on Reyna. Now that you mention it, he isn't here. Huh. I told him to follow my orders, yet he has never done that ever since we got here. Rumble, rumble. The moment those words left her mouth, the floor above them shook intensely, alerting the entire squad. Let's go. After the gesture, once again, flames emerged and encircled Reyna. Whoosh! Then, the flames spiraled upwards, instantly burning the ceiling and left it with a scorched, gaping hole. The flames gradually lowered down and contoured itself into a pair of flaming wings, or rather, phoenix wings, though both Evelyn and Reyna could fly with their wings. The difference between the two was that Reyna's wings consumed a lot of mana. It had to be said that Reyna's holy flames would overexhaust her mana as well. But Reyna was at the top of her class with absurd mana capacity. It would take a while until she would fully empty her tank. Such was Reyna's fighting style. In other words, she was walking and talking waste of mana. At that, she flew up to the 37th floor. But when she got there, the sight left her surprised with her mouth left agape. This, after leaving Reyna and the rest, Raven immediately took the stairs and made it all the way to the 37th floor. As soon as he stepped into the hall, a group of mages surrounded him. Sparks of magic were immediately hurled his way, but with shadow step, He could easily dodge and reappear for one of the mage's shadow. Yeah, it's his favorite ability. Slash. With 2 daggers in both hands, he easily dealt with the mage who seemed to have been caught off guard. Fuck, a special affini? Uck. Before the other mage finished, Raven threw one of his daggers at him, impaling him deeply. Swoosh. You have slain a human. Plus 5 EXP. Swiftly dashing across the halls, a barrage of magic pierced through the air towards him. But with adrenaline surge, his speed reflexes were greatly enhanced as he swiftly dodged each attack. Boom! The hall echoed as debris continued to fill the area. Holes etched on the walls due to the sheer impact of the magic attacks. With Shadow Step, on a short cooldown, Raven narrowly dodged each attack, while someone catch him off guard. Uck! A spark of lightning magic pierced him, but Raven immediately recovered and shadow-stepped, entering the mage's shadow. Slash! But as soon as he killed him, a figure holding a sword charged towards him. A duelist. Clang! Caught off guard once again, Raven parried the blade, but was instantly kicked on the side by another duelist. Thud! Raven skidded back several meters, and as he turned around, sparks of magic were sent towards him. Boom! However, Shadow Step. Raven instantly reappeared behind another mage and swung his dagger down. Huh! Huh! Raven had finally been able to catch his breath. But that didn't last for long as the 2 duelists had already charged toward him. Clang, clang. With only 1 dagger in his hand, he continued to parry each strike, swiftly maneuvering whenever one of the duelists staggers back from a force. Clang, clang, clang. This persisted as they continued to trade blows, parrying each other's weapon. Cracka! 2 bolts of lightning headed his way, the kind of attack Raven had been waiting for. As the lightning inched even closer, Raven took the opportunity and Shadow stepped behind one of the duelists. TSZZZZ. Raven stuck his dagger behind the duelist's back, and the lightning instantly finished him off. A friendly fire. Huh. Raven's lips curled into a sly smirk. Slash. You have slain a human. You have slain a human. Huh. Huh. After single-handedly clearing 5 floors, Raven took a breather and slumped down on a wall. Cuts and grazes etched all over his body, causing him to bleed profusely. Huh. Huh. If he could, he would have chugged down a healing potion to instantly fix himself up. However, he had long ran out of system coins to actually buy a single potion. What he opted for now was to wait for Reyna and the rest to catch up to him. Vush! And as if his wishes were granted, a towering inferno spiraled from beneath, just in front of him, leaving a scorched, gaping hole on the ground. From the hole emerged a familiar figure, adorning a pair of flaming wings that resembled a phoenix. Her long, pale, wheat hair fluttered as her feet landed on the ground. Her flawless facial features immediately registered in Raven's mind, despite his vision getting hazy. Reyna. Though, despite voicing out a tone in relief, Reyna knitted her brows as she locked her gaze with him. How reckless! Heh. All Raven could do was flash her smirk. He knew how reckless his actions were. From all the commotion that ensued, there was a high chance that Francis would escape with Amy. He had to come to her rescue as soon as possible. In truth, he would have liked it if Brandon were there to assist him, saving Amy together in the process. But Brandon had already done his part. It was all up to him now. Or rather, them. Oh, and another, until the rest of the special force arrived. They all turned to look at him with a frown. But Raven had expected it already and shrugged it off. The first one to approach him was Alexandra, knitting her brows as well. Idiot! She then kneeled down in front of him and placed both of her hands on his chest. Suddenly, a pure white glow illuminated from her hand, and Raven's minor injuries started to disappear. This continued until most of his injuries were stabilized. Such was the close relationship of the Special Force members. In short, they treated each other like family, and Raven was no exception, even if he wasn't a full member. Thank you, Alexandra. MHM. Alexandra flashed him a smile and nodded. She wasn't one of many words, and Raven knew that. But despite that, Alexandra had a warm personality, and that's what Raven liked about her. Raven then got up and turned towards the group. Guys! At his call, everyone turned to face him. What is it? Don't you think something feels off? Raven walked ahead. They all gave him space as he continued forward, but abruptly stopped and stared at the staircase. We've been here for a while now, causing quite the commotion. What about it? Reyna tilted her head, puzzled. All the commotion, all the fighting, and yet Francis or Darwin Osborne has yet to stop us. At his words, all the officers present had their eyes shot wide open. The realization had dawned upon them. Raven turned around and met their shocked gazes. Are they really here? But Clint said they were. He had never been wrong before. Drake anxiously retorted. What if he was wrong? What if it was an illusion? Raven had a point. It wouldn't be far-fetched to say that they could have been had. But if they were wrong, then there was no other lead. And that man, what was his name again? If I remember, the witness called her Mori? Moriarty. I see. But where is he? Maybe on the top floor. They were all out of ideas. Their next course of action was to push through and see the end of the operation. At that, the group beckoned to the next floor. Starting from the 42nd floor, it was once again a familiar sight. However, what they thought was the same setup was far from what they had imagined. Making their way to the center of the hallway, they were surrounded from all sides by wraith cultists. Slurp! Reyna licked her lips. As soon as she did, Drake's scream echoed the entire hallway. And not again. Vush! A wall of holy flames instantly encircled them. Reyna turned to glance towards them and flashed them a sadistic smile. Don't move. Click, click. Striding forward, the clicking of her heels echoed the entire hallway. For a moment, there was only silence. Click, click. Then, vush! Holy flames protruded from her feet, then her legs, slowly crawling all over her body. Bang! A pair of large phoenix wings emerged from behind her, instantly scorching the walls and the collateral damage it ensued. Flames cascaded all over the hallway, burning any of the poor mages it met. The mages tried to counterattack, hurling Reyna with a barrage of magic. Yet the flames would act as an armor and instantly dispersed whatever magic was thrown her way. Fuck! The Phoenix? She's a walking nuke. Raven could hear the rest of the officers' converse, while he stared directly at Reyna in awe. It was a familiar sight to him, the power that Reyna had. I want to catch up to her. The halls continued to burn, and no matter what kind of magic they threw at Reyna, she didn't spare a single glance in that direction. All she did was walk forward and, ha ha ha, laughed. Fucking sadist. Drake could only utter those words. They knew they were only extras whenever Reyna was around. But they didn't mind it. Despite all the profanity, they respected Reyna as she respected them back. They continued to watch and let the destruction ensue as the sadistic phoenix burned down the entire place. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha, ha 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 ha. Asterisk. At the end of it all, it seemed like all the mages had gathered back on the 42nd floor. It seemed like segregating their forces didn't work out for them due to Reyna. Yet despite what they did, they eventually met the same fate. All Drake could utter were the words, a walking fucking nuke. When they entered the 43rd floor, there were no signs of life. The same went for the next floor, and the next, and the next, until they arrived at the 50th floor. Truthfully, they didn't know just how powerful Francis and Darwin were. But Darwin was eligible enough to become an Astrea Academy professor, so he had to be significantly powerful, while Francis was the head of the Osborne family, meaning he should be several times more powerful than Darwin. At that, the group stood in front of the door. This should be the room, right? Yeah, we've checked every room. Reyna stood by the door, while Raven answered from behind her. Okay, stand back. The group nodded and took a step back. At that moment, flames gradually emerged from Reyna's hand. Slowly and slowly, until, Bush! 48 beyond it all, one. Puff. So, have you finished covering up your tracks? Everything is all settled, Sir Francis. Good. Francis took a quick glance at Amy, who was battered and bruised. She was once again unconsciously lying on the ground. He then continued. This girl, all she had told me was information I already knew. The man with the mask, but Francis clenched his teeth. It doesn't explain why she would follow Felix in that alleyway. What are you trying to say, Sir Francis? There was definitely someone else there, the person she was actually following. So, you think there was a fourth person in the crime scene? Only to my speculation, but most likely. Do you think that person will come? Francis knitted his brow skeptically. Huh? How could that happen? No one else knows our connection to this hotel besides the staff here. Ah, yes. That's right. The staff of the hotel that Francis hired were aspiring wraith cultists. Though, at the moment, they've yet to prove their capabilities to Francis. It had been 30 minutes since Francis had interrogated Amy, and the whole time, all she did was pathetically cry in front of him. This peeved Francis so. But regardless, he had to put up with it. All he had to do was inflict as much fear on Amy, to the point where she would want to end herself. But he turned to glance at her once again. Her will is quite admirable. Despite the gruesome torture that erupted, Amy wouldn't change her statement. It's always the man with a mask. As if that kind of information wasn't all over the internet. Francis then snapped out of his thoughts and replied to his nephew, Darwin. Anyway, come here now. I don't think that would be possible. Francis was alerted. The voice that spoke wasn't Darwin's. It was another man. Who? Who are you? What did you do to Dar? Click. Before he could continue, the call was abruptly cut off. Smack. Fuck. Francis lashed out and threw his phone on the ground. Wraiths were usually quite stoic, but being in a pact with Francis' body for over 18 years had significantly changed the Wraith's personality. Francis' personality was blending with his own, which is why he needed to summon his real body as soon as possible. But that time will come after I summon the Master. In other words, the Wraith that he served. There were different classes of Wraiths, a Neo and a Lesser, though they were still classified as Wraiths, while the one that stood above them would be the one they gave their subservience to, a full-fledged Wraith. Though Neos and Lessers were still classified as Wraiths, the gap between them and their master was incomparable. And though the Wraith that took over Francis seemed to be the leader, he was actually a Lesser. 1459. Yet he was deemed to be the leader as he was the first to make a pact within his clan and turn a human into a Wraithbound. His sole duty as the leader was to summon all of his clansmen, and at the end of it all, their master. He breathed out a heavy sigh. It seemed like Darwin was compromised for some reason. Fuck. Whoever the other man was, Francis didn't care. After all, it was just Darwin. Darwin would be Francis' nephew. But Francis was long gone, replaced by a Wraith. It was then when Francis noticed a small detail. He turned to look towards the door. He had realized something. It was quiet. Too quiet. Weren't there supposed to be guests? Francis abruptly got up and motioned towards the door. Creak. After opening the door, he peeked outside, only to realize that there was no one around. Rumble. Rumble. He could hear the ground beneath him rumble. What? He was in the room the whole time, yet he had never heard the sound until he went outside. Thus, he decided to confirm if that was actually the case. He then went back inside the room as he shut the door. It was awfully quiet. Once again, he did the same thing, going outside and back inside. Again, and again, and again. This doesn't make any sense. It was the same result. If he stood out in the hallway, he could definitely hear rumbling. But if he was in the room, it would be eerily quiet. Wait, he realized. At that, he thoroughly thrashed the room, looking for a specific device. Books were now strewn on the floor. Bang! Bookshelves tumbled down. Documents scattered, fluttering in the air. Fuck, where is it? He continued to thoroughly scan every inch and every corner of the room, until he finally found it. He held the device in his hand. A white circular device with magic circles etched onto it. It was a sound barrier device. CR. Crack. He gripped it tightly until it broke down into pieces. At that moment, Francis started to panic. Who could have placed it here? There was no one else that had access to the room. Besides, Darwin. But there's no way he would betray me. However, it was possible. Darwin wasn't a Wraithbound yet. But why? Didn't he want to become a Wraithbound? Fuck. Francis disheveled his hair, ruffling it as hard as he could. Wait, could it be? The man, through his speculations, It seemed likely that Darwin was working for the man who took the call for him. Things weren't going well for him as he had hoped. He had yet to successfully turn a human into a wraithbound. Felix was the only exception, and yet he died. Despite the aspiring cultists he had gathered, none of them seemed to be compatible to become a wraithbound. He turned to glance at Amy, still unconscious. She was the only one that was compatible at the moment. Fuck, is that girl still sleeping for? At that, Francis made his way to the sleeping Amy. Thwack! He struck his feet on her face. Yet she didn't wake up. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Fucking wake up. Just hold in Amy. He'll stop sooner or later. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Despite all the kicking she suffered, Amy persisted, secretly clenching her teeth to somehow mitigate the pain. Yet she knew how futile of an attempt it was. It hurts. Her entire body ached from the severe beating, and she could feel her lungs filled with the heat of the smoke. Thwack, thwack. She held back her tears. If she would give Francis the idea that she was awake, then only time would tell what would happen to her. Please, someone, save me. The moment Francis destroyed the device, she had also heard the rumbling coming from below. She realized someone was coming. After all the despair, she could finally be hopeful. Thwack, thwack. All she had to do was endure the pain. To persevere. To persevere. To wait until whoever her savior was to arrive. The entrance to the room was engulfed in holy flames, scorching it down. As soon as the flames dispersed, the room became visible. What met their line of sight was a room painted entirely white, and Francis mercilessly letting out his frustrations on an unconscious Amy. As soon as Raven made out the sight of Amy, he clenched his teeth and gripped his dagger as tightly as he could. Amy, step! Raven immediately stepped forward. But as soon as he did, Raina got ahead of him and motioned with her hand for him to stop. Stand down, Raven. Raven was taken aback. Raina would usually poke fun at him and call him Shirley or Sherlock. But now, things were different. Raina was serious. Raina pursed her lips as holy flames gradually crawled up from her feet and onto her torso. The rest of the special force seemed to take the hint as well and stood back, letting Raina do her thing. That man, she paused, the flames gradually engulfing her entire being, is a wraithbound. At the mention of wraithbound, Raven's entire body shuddered. Cold sweat started to bead from his forehead, dripping down. Bah! Thump! Bah! Thump! He felt the quickening of his heartbeat as he stepped his foot on the ground. Ha! Ha! Suddenly, he felt his breath grow heavy. Shifting his gaze to Francis, Raven's pupils dilated the moment he caught a glimpse of his eyes. Those eyes, a familiar sight, just like that of a wraith. He then peered down at his hands. They were trembling. After all, the day when Raven tried to take his own life. A wraith appeared in his vision. The wraith offered a pact with him in exchange for power. However, Raven didn't accept. If for some reason he was still alive, despite jumping off a building. That mere fact made Raven question his entire being. Did I accept the offer? How am I alive? But I know I didn't. That day, it haunted him. Every day, he clenched his teeth. Every hour, gripping the handle of his dagger. Every minute, drip, drip. Blood started to drip from his hand. Step. He took a step back. Raven. Alexandra's voice, drowned out by the overwhelming fear that engulfed him. At that, Alexandra approached him. Raven suddenly felt warmth spreading across his back. He turned around only to find Alexandra embracing him. As she continued to embrace him, a pure white glow illuminated from Raven. The moment it did, all of Raven's fears vanished. His mind cleared and the anxiety that threatened to engulf him receded. It was one of Alexandra's skills, serene aura. By channeling the essence of life itself, Alexandra can wash away fears, doubts, and negative emotions, replacing them with a sense of serenity. Hugh. Raven took deep and steady breaths. He then turned towards Alexandra, who had already pulled away from the embrace. Thank you, his tone with a hint of relief, while Alexandra nodded and gave him a warm smile. MHM. At that, Raven glanced in front of him. While he was gripped by fear, Reyna and the rest of the task force, excluding Alexandra, were already engaged in combat with Francis. And they were losing. Click, click. Striding forward, Reyna narrowed her eyes and met Francis' gaze. How many years has he been a wraithbound? She couldn't tell. But what she did know was that Francis was a full-fledged wraithbound. Who knew the head of a major conglomeration was actually a wraithbound? She stifled a laugh. It was ridiculous. To think a wraithbound was right under their noses the entire time. The only reason she knew was because Francis didn't hide it anymore. His aura seethed with wraith miasma, and for Reyna it felt suffocating. Puff. HM? Who are you? Truth be told, Reyna was quite famous as well, though not as famous as Evelyn. Despite adorning the Special Force uniform, it seemed like Francis didn't recognize Reyna at all. No, he definitely recognized the uniform, just not the wearer herself. Click, click. With the soft clicking of her heels, Reyna kept her guard up. Puff. Francis peered his gaze away, and with a long drag of his cigarette, the smoke gradually became thicker and thicker, until she realized the entire room was now engulfed in a thick fog of smoke. Whoosh! Suddenly, she could see silhouettes that seemed to look like Francis. Whoosh! She extended her hand to shoot a small torrent of flames at the figure, only to disperse the smoke. Yet the silhouette disappeared, and the smoke thickened once more. She had to be careful with the flame's trajectory, as it might burn the unconscious Amy. It was quite the handicap, especially with her destructive affinity. But she was the only one up to the task. She deemed the rest of the special force to be subpar for Francis. It's not like the members were weak. But Francis, he was in a whole different league. And Reyna knew that too. Even she couldn't feel like she had any chance of victory. But for the moment, she was the only choice. If I could just buy enough time for Miss Evelyn to arrive. It had been quite a while since they re-entered the hotel. So what's taking Miss Evelyn so long? But she knew Evelyn wasn't stupid. Wherever she was, and whatever she was doing, it would most definitely be to increase their chances of defeating Francis. Redirecting her attention to the smoke, a silhouette emerged once again. No, it wasn't just one, but two silhouettes. Whoosh! The silhouettes would disappear, then reappear, inching, closing to Reyna. Whoosh! She reinforced herself with holy flames. The flames gradually crawled up to engulf her entire figure. Puff! As the puffing sound of a cigarette reached her ears, an invisible force hurled Reyna away, crashing onto the wall. Boom! Ugh! Before she could comprehend what had just happened, 3 more silhouettes entered her vision. Whoosh! Before the silhouettes managed to inch closer to her, pink crystals protruded from the ground and dispersed the smoke. But right as the smoke dispersed, it thickened up once more. Reyna shifted her attention to trace the source of the crystals. What met her sight was the figure of a girl with pink hair and black eyes. It was Francine, and she had entered the smoke fog. Francine, get out of here. This smoke, it's a domain yucca. Before Reyna could finish, once again, an invisible force smashed her on the ground. Leader, the same went for Francine, who was sent crashing on the wall. Fuck! Drake urgently entered the smoke. With a knife in his hand, he immediately slit his wrist. Drip! Drip! His wrist bled profusely. Slap! Extending his arm, he clasped his hands together. Then, PSHHHH. The blood from his wrist spiraled in his palms and was shot out indefinitely. This was possible because of Drake's affinity. Blood. With his affinity, he can even redirect his blood to clot his injuries, healing himself in the process. Whenever a silhouette appears, Drake would redirect his aim. But yet again, the smoke would only disperse and thicken up once it does. Before he realized what had just happened, an invisible force gripped his body and sent him flying. Boom! Reyna got up, only to find her squad mates on the ground. She clenched her teeth and muttered to herself, Miss Evelyn, please hurry. Puff! Unbeknownst to the special force, Francis was seated, puffing on a cigarette the entire time. For the majority of the fight, Francis did not even lift a finger. This was because of his affinity, or rather, Francis' affinity. Vapor, an advanced manifestation of the water affinity. Technically, Francis didn't have the vapor affinity. But ever since becoming a wraithbound, his water affinity gradually evolved and turned into the vapor affinity. Whenever a wraith possesses a human, they found themselves unable to use their real abilities. They could only use the abilities that the human body possessed, which is why not every human was a viable candidate to becoming a wraithbound. With a vapor affinity, Francis could control and shape various types of vapor, including cigarette smoke, steam, mist, and fog. But due to the real Francis' smoking tendencies, he opted for cigarettes as his main smoke. He can shape and contour the smoke into anything he wills. He could condense the smoke to the point where it would solidify, giving off the impression of a tangible but invisible force. Indeed, inside the smoke fog is Francis' domain. He was unstoppable. Puff! As he condensed the smoke, several silhouettes that seemed to look like his figure materialized. He then turned around, only to find the figure of a woman slowly inching closer. Raina realized how hopeless the fight was. If she could, she would have already burned the entire room along with Francis in the process. It was possible because it was Raina, but she was severely handicapped due to Amy being present in the room. There was no way to defeat Francis under the circumstances. If they wanted to defeat him, no, to survive until Evelyn arrives, then they have to get Amy out of the room first, which is why she had formed a plan with Raven. The room was quite dark, but with the light that emerges from her flames, a shadow behind her would be visible. Click, click. Clenching her teeth, Raina strode forward, and as the force tried to push her back, the holy flames behind her expanded to mitigate the force. Click, click. She continued forward. Drip, drip. Cuts and grazes started to appear at her body. She could feel the smoke solidify enough to the point where it condensed and shaped itself into razors. Drip, drip. Despite the bleeding, she continued forward. Click, click. The clicking of her heels echoed the entire room. She clenched her teeth to mitigate the pain, but she knew it was futile. She knew her entire body was in pain. Drip, drip. Blood continued to drip. She didn't just suffer light cuts and grazes anymore. No, she might have not noticed, but her abdomen had started to bleed profusely. But with the holy flames engulfing her entire being, all of the cuts would gradually heal. She just had to push through. Click, click. She could feel her mana start to drain from the overuse of her holy flames. Her previously confident expression had already crumbled. But yet again, she did not falter and continued to stride forward. Click, click. The clicking of her heels. The pungent smell of tobacco in the room. The only light that illuminated the room were from her flames. Drip, drip. Her blood dripping on the ground and instantly healing, rapidly depleting her mana reserves. Gazing in front, Amy was only a few inches away. She then turned around and urgently raised her voice. Raven, locking eyes with him. Raven nodded and immediately appeared behind her shadow. As soon as he did, Raina's mana reserves were out of tank. Crash! Her holy flames gradually dispersed, and Raina was sent crashing. Her abdomen cut wide open and bled profusely. At that, Raina had fulfilled her duty. Her vision hazy, she focused on Raven who stood before the unconscious Amy. It was all up to Raven now. At that, Raina closed her eyes. Gazing in front of him, what met Raven's sight was an unconscious Amy. But to his surprise, Amy abruptly opened her eyes and immediately responded. Raven, please help me. Raven was surprised, but immediately changed his expressions. Whoosh! Activating adrenaline surge. Raven's speed was greatly enhanced, and before he knew it, he was already an inch from the chains. But as soon as he got there, a silhouette appeared in front of him. He'd seen this happen already. A silhouette would emerge, only for his squad mates to strike at nothing but air. However, it wasn't an empty silhouette. It was the Real Francis. Francis pinched his chin and seemed to scan him. Gazing into Francis' eyes, the feeling of fear gripped Raven again, but not as suffocating as earlier, as serene aura was still in effect. Francis then opened his mouth. Interesting. Your shadow stepping inside Francis' shadow. Raven tried to cut him down. However, boom, he was immediately sent crashing on the wall behind him. Yucca. He spat out blood. Since he was caught off guard, he didn't brace for impact. Step, step. Francis inched closer to him once again. But the moment he did, clang. One of the chains that seemed to bound Amy broke. Francis turned around, only to find crystal spikes protruding from the ground, cutting the chain. Tisk! Francis clicked his tongue. For some reason, Francis was interested enough in Raven, to the point where he disregarded Amy. This piqued Raven's curiosity. Is it because he's a wraithbound? Am I actually... He dismissed his thoughts. He knew that he declined the offer back then. Yet for some reason, it still gripped his heart. Unsure. But regardless, he dismissed his thoughts. There was no point in pondering on it now. Not when Amy had yet to be saved. In front of him, blood shaped like a laser shot out from Drake's direction, trying to cut down the other chain. However, clang. It was abruptly stopped by the dense smoke. As Francis' attention was away from him, Raven used the opportunity to cut down Francis. Clang. But once again, his dagger was abruptly stopped by the condensing smoke. At that moment, a familiar voice reached his ears. Raven. It was Alexandra, who clasped her hands together. At that moment, a bright hollow glow emerged from her palms and illuminated the entire room. Due to the blinders shielding the room from any source of moonlight, the room was completely dark. Hence, there wasn't any available shadow for Raven to step into. But with the light from Alexandra illuminating the entire room, shadows now became visible to him, and one of them was Amy's. Raven used the opportunity to instantly step inside Amy's shadow. With a dagger in his hand, Raven swung it down to cut the chains. Clank! Go! Amy immediately nodded and made her way towards the exit. The same went for Drake and Francine, who hurried outside as well. After all, wraithbounds were out of their jurisdiction. Their only goal was to save Amy. They didn't expect for Francis to be a wraithbound. The only ones who could even match a wraithbound was Raina and Evelyn, who were guild members. But due to the severe handicap, Raina was out of commission. Raven immediately followed suit and tried to leave the room. However, the moment he did, something gripped the back of his neck. He was then raised up and slowly turned his head to find Francis, staring deep into his eyes. The grip tightened, and he dropped both of his daggers down. Raven! His squad mates looked at him in horror. And the moment one of them stepped forward, Francis opened his mouth. Don't move. At Francis' instructions, the group did not proceed and watched the scene in horror. From behind Raven, Francis' voice reached his ears. I have no use for the girl anymore. He then locked his gaze with Raven. But you on the other hand. The moment those words left Francis' mouth, a chill ran down Raven's spine. An anomaly? An anomaly? What was he talking about? Bah! Thump! Bah! Thump! Raven's heart pounded in his chest as Francis' cold eyes bored into him. The others in front of him shifted uneasily, watching him in horror. They couldn't move. They couldn't help him. If they did, who knows what might happen to Raven. What a... Francis' grip on his neck tightened even more. Your abilities, your very existence, it's all wrong. A defect in the universe itself. Raven's mind raced. He had always known he was different, the system, his abilities. But to be called a mistake, a defect by this man, it chilled him down to his core. Raven clenched his fist. Francis seemed to know more about him than he had ever known himself. But each and every one of his words made Raven wonder what exactly was so special about him, to the point where he would be granted a system. No, what exactly is the system? And why do I have it? Regardless, he knew the only one who could answer his question was Francis. At least, that's what he thought. And as Raven was about to open his mouth to ask the question, boom! The window shattered and tore down the blinders while the room shook intensely. Glass shards sprawled all over the floor. Unexpectedly, the force of Francis' grip on his neck loosened. And as he turned his head to look at Francis, to his surprise, blood dripped down from Francis' mouth. Thud! As Francis' grip loosened even more, Raven fell to the ground. Raven then motioned back and turned his attention to what exactly happened. What met his sight was a hollow golden spear that impaled Francis. Thump! Francis knelt on the ground, and he seemed to turn his head behind him. Following his direction, Raven looked behind the shattered window as well, only to find Evelyn, a pair of hollow golden wings protruding from her back as she floated in the air. Her eyes, once purple, had shifted into a bright golden glow. Raven then shifted his attention to Evelyn's hand, or rather, the man Evelyn was holding. The familiar sight of the man with red hair and blue eyes instantly registered within Raven's eyes. It was none other than Clint. They seemed to have made it in time to save him. But Raven felt uneasy. Francis must have been the key to him solving the mystery regarding the system. But it seemed like Francis' days were over. Just one attack from Evelyn had him bleeding profusely. The gap between them was too large, and despite wanting to know more about the system, Raven couldn't jeopardize the operation. However, as he was lost in his thoughts, something, or rather, someone caught his attention. From a rooftop, quite a significant distance from Evelyn, a man stood still and watched the entire scene. Though Raven couldn't quite see him as his vision was blurry, the man seemed to don a white mask. Raven instantly knew who he was. Moriarty. But Raven couldn't believe what he was seeing. He rubbed his eyes to better fix his peripheral vision. But as soon as he slowly opened them, Moriarty was gone, as if he was never there in the first place. Questions with no answers started to flood his mind. But Raven was certain about one thing. The entire operation, they were dancing at the palm of his hands. The documents, the crime, Felix's death, could have been pre-planned by Moriarty, leading Raven to this moment. But he didn't know. Tisk. He clicked his tongue in frustration. Once again, Moriarty was one step ahead of him. Brandon stood a few rooftops from the hotel. He decided to stay and watch the entire scene unfold. The reason for this was because he was unsure if the system would reward him if he strayed away from the quest zone. But to his surprise, the moment the chains that bound Amy broke, the notification popped up. Quest completed. Rewards obtained. EXP, plus 300. Stat points, plus 5. System coins, plus 100. He then muttered to himself. System. Name, Brandon Locke. Level 4. EXP, 380/1000. Class, Anomaly. Rectangle, you are an entity that does not belong to this world. An anomaly. Passive, Rectangle Skill Weaver. Rectangle, create any skill possible within the user's capabilities. Rectangle, increase your capacity by plus 1 per level. Rectangle, total skills, 3 of 4. Skill tab. Stats. Stat points available, 5. Rectangle STRF. Rectangle MP, F+. Rectangle Def, F. Rectangle AGI, F. Rectangle Int, Rectangle Charm, F+. System Shop. System coins, 250. Quests available, 0. After the fight with mages back in the lobby, Brandon realized just how severely disadvantaged he was when it came to a contest of strength. Once his stamina was drained, his strength would gradually diminish in the process. Thus, Brandon decided to pour it all into STR until it advanced to the F+ tier. And with the remaining stat point, he poured it into AGI. After that, he closed the system and decided to leave the scene. But the moment he did, not bad, a voice from behind reached his ears. He turned around to trace the source of the voice. However, to his surprise, there was no one there. I've set the stage for you, and the voice from behind. He turned around once again, only to find nothing. You've completely exceeded my expectations. Brandon turned around. But once again, there was nothing. No one. What the fuck is going on? From what he could register, the voice sounded like it belonged to a man. But the voice was unfamiliar to him. Those documents you found. Again, there was no one. Did you really think Osborne left it there on purpose? What is he talking about? No one. No one was there. Just a voice. But Brandon couldn't shake off the feeling of the man's presence. He was definitely there, but would move fast enough before Brandon could see him. Congratulations, Brandon Locke. The man. He knows my name. despite adorning the Mirage mask. You have passed the screening test. Brandon stood still and stopped turning around whenever the voice registers. Yet he could definitely hear the man speaking from behind him. Finally, Brandon opened his mouth to reply. What are you talking about? The moment those words left Brandon's mouth, the entire area shifted. No, it was warping. A black void cascaded the sky and gradually sealed off the entire rooftop. This ability, there was no doubt within Brandon's mind. It was the space affinity. But who? From what he remembered from the novel, a character had never appeared with this space affinity. So who could it be? As the entire area had finally been sealed off by what seems to be a reality domain, the voice once again reached him. Greetings, Brandon Locke. We finally met. Turning around, what met Brandon's line of sight was a man with jet black hair and ink black eyes, sitting on what seems to be a throne. How would you like to join the Primordials? The man's eyes, as if he was staring deep into Brandon's soul. The only way Brandon could describe it was as if he was staring deep into the abyss. Brandon's entire body shuddered. He looked down. His hands, they were both shaking. But nonetheless, he had to reply. What do you mean? The Primordials. You know about us, don't you? Indeed he does. But how does the man know that? Brandon then concluded that the man was a member of the organization. Which seed are you? He had a faint idea. Brandon knew each and every one of the seated members. All except one. The first. The man confirmed his suspicions, and Brandon's eyes shot wide open. In all the chapters he had read from the novel, not once did the first seed appear. There were other extra characters Brandon didn't know about. But this man, he was a major antagonist. And yet, Brandon knew next to nothing about him. He took a step back, and as soon as he did, the man in front of him was long gone, and he felt a hand on his shoulder. Calm down. The man's voice, monotonous, yet it felt as if he was amused. Turning around, the man had long disappeared. Brandon then returned his attention back to the throne. Once again, the man was seated as if he was sitting the entire time. Even with mana disruption, under his arsenal, he knew it was futile. There were no subtle movements whenever the man would appear behind him. He couldn't find the right timing to disrupt the mana accurately, nor did he know where to actually disrupt it. Brandon clenched his fists. He knew he was powerless before him. And as he was lost in his thoughts, the man's voice reached him once more. Ah, that's right. The man stood up from his throne. This is the face you're used to. The man lifted his hand and swiped his face. Suddenly, the man's face instantly warped, as if his face glitched out. The same went for his hair, then his entire body. Recognize me? Brandon's eyes shot wide open. His entire being shuddered, unable to comprehend the sight before him. Sweat started to form in his palms, as cold sweat started beating from his forehead. He couldn't believe it. The man was indistinguishable from his former appearance. But blue hair, blue eyes. It was an appearance that Brandon was quite familiar with. Hey, Alpha, the one you know, but not exactly. What do you mean? Did you really think Leon bought your lie? Indeed, Brandon realized just how easy it was for Alpha to believe him. He played with fire. He was too arrogant just because he had read the novel. He knew that, but way too late. The moment you told him about being the first seat, he immediately reported to Nella. Nella, you know her as well, don't you? Pulcinella. In other words, the 12th seat. Correct. After the man uttered those words, he tossed a peculiar item in Brandon's way. Brandon turned to scan the item on the ground. He was familiar with it. Alpha's burner phone. Is he dead? For quite a while. Since when have you been pretending? Can you guess? Brandon pondered for a while, but the mere thought of it happening on that day sent a chill down his spine. Brandon pursed his lips. Before the party. Correct. The man immediately responded, as if he knew that Brandon would arrive at the right conclusion. So this entire time, Brandon knew. I should have killed Alpha right there and then. His plans. What he knew was under his control. Evelyn, Raven, and the rest. The ones who were supposed to be dancing in his palms. But he was horribly wrong. The one pulling his strings the entire time was none other than the man in front of him. But for what reason? What do you want from me? The first seat. You can take it. The moment those words left the man's mouth, he appeared before Brandon. Step. Brandon instinctively stepped back. The man appeared way too fast for him to react. His voice reached Brandon's ears once again. Though you're still quite too weak. The man then stepped back and turned around. I'll give you 3 years. By then you must be able to defeat the 11th seat. Brandon was flabbergasted. There were 12 seats in total. So why should he start from the 11th? Yet as if his thoughts were read, the man responded. That's because Nella is dead. I killed her. The other seats shouldn't know about you yet. Brandon didn't know how to respond. None of the man's words even registered to him. It felt as if everything he knew was a lie. It was all too overwhelming for him at the moment. The man turned around and met Brandon's gaze. Staring deep into his ink-black eyes made Brandon shudder in fear. His mind told him to run, to get far away from the man. And yet his body wouldn't listen to him, as if he was frozen in place. He turned around to face Brando. Though, the man's next words reached Brandon's ears. I'd like to see what your current level is at. However, the words came from behind him. Instantly, Brandon turned around and blew a gust of wind to distance himself from the man. But as soon as he did, the man had already appeared in front of him, as if the wind didn't faze him at all. Boom! Brandon skidded back several meters. Cracka! Bolts of black lightning headed his way. Brandon tried his best to avoid the attack, but before he knew it, the lightning had already struck him. Brandon was sent hurling away, crashing on the ground. With wind magic in his palms, Brandon abruptly got up. But once again, the man appeared before him and struck him in the abdomen with a wind-empowered fist. Clearly, the man was a deviant. And just like Brandon, he had more than 2 elements. From what Brandon could conclude, the man had shown lightning, wind, and space. Yet it seemed like that wasn't all. As Brandon skidded back, a portal materialized behind him and black ice crystals emerged, raining down on him. TSZZZ. Brandon abruptly dodged, empowering himself with blue sparks of lightning. Yet, the man was directly following him, leaving trails of black sparks, as if he was copying what Brandon would do. Brandon shifted his trajectory, and an ice sword materialized in his hand. Clang! He swung it down, only for the man to parry with his own black ice sword. But for some reason, CR. Crack! Only Brandon's sword shattered. The man's amused voice reached his ears. Fascinating, right? Brandon stood still, staring at the man. The man tossed his sword up. Then, with his palms, the man sent a torrent of black flames at the sword. The sword should have melted if it was ice. However, it didn't. At that, Brandon realized it wasn't a sword made of ice. It was a sword made out of the crystal affinity. Taking deep, heavy breaths, Brandon knelt down on the ground, supporting himself with a chipped ice sword. Cuts and grazes appeared all over his body, bleeding profusely. But under the surge of adrenaline, the pain was mitigated temporarily. Looking in front of him, the vast darkness of the reality domain continued to engulf the entire area. It gave him the impression that the man that conjured the domain had vast amounts of mana. The fight persisted for what he thinks might have been 20 minutes already. Yet the only one to have suffered any damage was Brandon. Not once had he ever landed a single hit on the man. Whenever he used mana disruption, another magic would be sent his way, as if the man wasn't fazed at all that his mana was disrupted. But most of the time, Brandon couldn't time mana disruption perfectly. Brandon was unsure if the man knew how to counter mana disruption, or he was just that skilled. But he felt like it was the latter. In other words, Brandon was outmatched. Along with the fight against the real Leon, or, rather, Alpha, this was the second time Brandon had ever felt this way. To be so defeated, to the point where he was helpless. To be backed in a corner, unable to defend himself. Biting his lip and clenching his fist, Brandon lifted his head and looked at the man in front of him. The man walked around the reality domain. His figure had yet to suffer any injuries. The black blazer that he adorned, free from any cuts or creases. The man then scanned his black crystal sword with the tip of his finger. He turned his head to meet Brandon's gaze. Staring deep into the man's ink-black eyes made Brandon shudder in fear. The man could kill him with a lift of his finger, and yet he didn't. After all, he wanted something from Brandon. But the mere fact that if that weren't the case, I wouldn't be alive right now. As Brandon was lost deep within his thoughts, the man's mouth opened. I'm quite disappointed. I thought you would give it your all. Brandon clenched his teeth. He knew he'd given it his all. He had used everything within his arsenal: fire, water, wind, ice, lightning. Yet the man wouldn't acknowledge his efforts. No, there was one more skill. His trump card. The one skill that should be out of cooldown. And to his surprise, it was finally available for use. But before he could gather his thoughts, the man spoke up once again. I've changed my mind. If you can't land a single hit. The man paused. The suspense bore down on Brandon as he swallowed his saliva. The man locked eyes with him as he uttered, narrowing his eyes at Brandon. I'll kill you instead. Adrenaline once again surged within Brandon. Now that the man was about to kill him, there was no need to hesitate. Accelerated cognition. The world started to go dull. His thoughts focused on the man that stood before him. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Yet for some reason, boom, he was still losing. Brandon skidded back several meters. And before he knew it, TSZZ, the man had already appeared before him. Brandon could come up with several counters after each muscle, each joint, each move the man would make. Before the man could swing down his sword at him, another ice sword materialized in Brandon's left hand. Gripping it, he parried the man's sword. Clang! With another sword in his right hand, he swung down. Whoosh! Yet he slashed at nothing but air. You're finally taking this seriously. The voice came from behind him. TSZZ. Brandon distanced himself away from the man. But as soon as he inched away, spurt, a black crystal sword unknowingly emerged from a portal and impaled him from the back. Despite being under the effects of accelerated cognition, it was a move that he hadn't calculated. He had never fought a mage with the space affinity before. It was out of his volition. Redirecting his attention in front of him, the man seemed to have opened a portal and stuck his sword inside it. Yucca! Brandon spat out blood. As the man pulled the sword away from the portal, Brandon felt the blade from behind him loosen up as well. Drip! Drip! Blood continued to drip down from his back. Is that all? Fuck. One last chance. The moment those words left the man's mouth, Brandon blinked back to distance himself, leaving trails of blue sparks. But the moment he did, the man blinked to chase him, leaving his own trail of black sparks. Skill Weaver. Clang, clang. They continued to exchange blows, each parry chipping away Brandon's ice sword. Kill. Error. You do not meet the level requirements for this skill. Clang, clang. Kill him. Error. You do not meet the level requirements for this skill. Clang, clang. Under the effects of accelerated cognition, Brandon's thoughts would rapidly shift. From calculating each counter to the man's moves, to thinking about what skill to create. He could feel the mental fatigue, as his body had started to overheat. Clang, clang. Fuck. Error. Not a skill. Fucking useless. Error. Not a skill. Win. Anything. Just fucking win. Are you sure? Yes. Initializing Skill Weaver. Downloading data. ETA 1 minute. Who are you even talking to? Shut up. Brandon knew that if he hadn't used accelerated cognition, then he wouldn't be able to keep up. Foo. Clang, clang. The two continued to exchange blows, while Brandon waited for the skill to create. Cuts and grazes appeared in his body once more, continuing to bleed. Brandon knew that if he hadn't used accelerated cognition, then he wouldn't be able to keep up. Foo! With wind conjured in his palms, he pushed himself away, distancing away from the man. But TSZZZ. Once again, the man chased him down and instantly appeared right in front of him, leaving trails of black sparks. Clank! As their swords clashed, both of Brandon's ice swords completely shattered, and as soon as the black crystal sword was about to reach him. Skill Tap. Mana Burst. Right angle enables the user to unleash a concentrated surge of mana, temporarily enhancing their speed and power to unprecedented levels. Right angle by channeling their mana reserves to their utmost limit. The user can achieve remarkable bursts of agility and strength, surpassing their normal capabilities for a brief moment. This, though, it wasn't a skill he had come up with, and if he could, he would have liked a better one. It was a waste of skill capacity, but it was now out of his hands. It will do. At that moment, his entire being started to surge with mana. Adrenaline pumped within his blood. The profuse bleeding had temporarily stopped, though the wound was still there. Despite everything, the pain that engulfed him had been somewhat alleviated. Swoosh! In a split second, before the sword could reach him, Brandon instantly seized the edge of the crystal sword with his hand. The sword slid his palm, but Brandon tightened his grip on the sword. CR. Crack! The crystal sword cracked, and with his other hand, he thrusted his fist with a wind-empowered punch. Thud! Yet despite the surprise attack, which should have happened in a single second, the man was able to block it with his fist. Drip! Drip! His other hand started bleeding. But regardless, it wasn't all in vain. Brandon took deep, heavy breaths, then pursed his lips to say, "Ha! I hit you." After Brandon's victory by small margin, the man lifted the reality domain. The once black void that covered the sky gradually dissolved. The marble floor of the rooftop, that should have had cracks and holes, had started to disappear. As the voice continued to dissolve, it seemed like the sun was about to rise. Brandon was flabbergasted, but did not show it in his expression. Space affinity? I need it. The man turned around to face him. Brandon stared deep within his ink-black eyes. The man's voice then reached his ears. So, will you accept my offer? The man then flashed him a grin. But that grin sent a chill down Brandon's spine. The reason was because the man's total personality could be described as monotonous. The man would smile, but his eyes wouldn't move. The tone in his voice had no color to it as well. Brandon pondered for a while. He couldn't see any benefits in joining the Primordials. After all, the Primordials was a mercenary group that would take any job, from contracted killing to thievery. At least, that's what he should have thought. But the first seat, I know nothing about him. Brandon opened his mouth and locked gaze with the man. Do I call you boss? The man didn't respond. His expressions stayed blank. Brandon tilted his head as well. Then for the first time, the man's expression changed, though it was only his mouth, his eyes stayed the same. PFFF. Ha ha. Brandon tilted his head once again, unsure about what the man found so amusing. The man then returned his previous blank expression. So will you accept the offer? I'll think about it. He was definitely not going to think about it, but it was all he could do to buy him some time. Enough time until he was strong enough to defeat the entire organization. But as soon as those ideas flooded his mind, another plan sparked in his head. Infiltration. If he were to defeat the Primordials someday, then it was better to keep them close and gain their trust. It seemed like the man had expectations for him. This dictated Brandon's next course of action. He had to ask, will you train me? No. I see. It was worth a try. Ever since transmigrating in this world, the first seat was the strongest mage Brandon had ever encountered. Even stronger than Evelyn. And as if the man had read his mind, his voice reached Brandon's ears. Evelyn is sufficient enough. How did you know that? Just a hunch. Boss. HM. No need for such formalities. Let's see. The man pinched his chin as his eyes darted above. Call me Gene from now on. Gene. Most likely an alias. But it didn't matter. Brandon had done the same when the man pretended to be Alpha and started calling him Moriarty. The man then locked his gaze with him. Once again, his face was blank. Like I said, I'll give you 3 years. Defeat the 11th seat and steadily rise the ranks. What do I have to do that for? To take the first seat. So, in other words, become my proxy. It made sense. The other seats did not know anything about the first seat as well, as far as Brandon knew from the novel. All except one. What about the second seat? She won't harm you. I guarantee that. I see. The two continued to converse. Brandon was puzzled why Gene had chosen him. But as much as he had asked, Gene had never given him a straight answer. In the end, Gene opened up a portal that led to somewhere Brandon didn't know. Before Gene entered the portal, he turned to look at Brandon, who was heavily exhausted. Jin's voice reached Brandon's ears. "Whenever you're ready, call me." "The burner phone, right? What do you think?" At that, the man entered the portal as the portal dispersed at the same time. Then, Brandon slumped down by the railings. "Huh, huh." Taking deep, heavy breaths, he opted for the system shop and bought a bundle of potions. He lifted the cask and chugged down a potion. Instantly, all of Brandon's wounds started to disappear. But he was paranoid. He had lost a lot of blood from fighting the mages in the hotel, then fighting Gene. He chugged down another potion again, and again, and again. Standing up, he turned to look at the sky. The sun was already up. Retrieving his phone, he turned it on. After he ended the call with Evelyn a while back, he turned his phone off. The phone turned on, and he could see a bunch of notifications. No, not a bunch. There were 10, 20, 50, 60 missed calls. There was some from the group chat, but it was mostly from Belle. He let out a heavy sigh. The last time he had spoken to Belle was when they were arguing. He then checked the time. 6:37 a.m. Thankfully, lectures were suspended for the week, as the next batch of students would have their Battle Royale session. Whomp! He let out a yawn. Due to the exhaustion, his eyes started to grow heavy. It didn't register to him earlier because of the adrenaline. But now, he slumped down, slowly closing his eyes. "Guess I'll go home later." A portal materialized inside a seemingly abandoned warehouse, and a man emerged from the portal. His jet-black hair fluttered from the portal's pressure as his ink-black eyes scanned the entire surroundings. It was none other than Gene, the first seat. What met his sight was a man with blue, disheveled hair, prostrating himself before him. "My lord, it's good to see you again." "MHM, good job, Darwin." Darwin lifted his head, and their eyes met. Darwin's mouth parted, his tone anxious. "I've done everything you've asked of me, my lord. Am I now eligible to join the Primordials?" "Sure." Since Darwin was an Osborn, Francis would immediately be involved in the crime. All Gene had to do next was to set the stage for Brandon, to see whatever methods Brandon would use to save Amy. Jin's entire plan was to expose Francis Osborn, a Wraithbound, which is why when Francis gave Darwin the task to finally kidnap Amy, Gene appeared before Darwin. Unbeknownst to Francis, Darwin was instructed by Gene to kidnap Amy under broad daylight and reveal his face to the world. Since Darwin was an Osborn, Francis would immediately be involved in the crime. All Gene had to do next was to set the stage for Brandon, to see whatever methods Brandon would use to save Amy. And Brandon exceeded his expectations. Amy was saved, and Francis was killed without Brandon directly involving himself in the fight. Gene then redirected his attention to Darwin, who continued to kneel before him. "All right, your reward." Darwin lifted his head. "Thank you, my Lord Uck." A portal materialized behind Darwin, and a myriad of black crystals rained down on him. Darwin spontaneously twitched as a result, blood splattering all over the area. This persisted until Gene was sure that Darwin was absolutely dead. At that, Gene peered down at Darwin, narrowing his eyes. "Disgusting cultist." After those words left his mouth, Gene turned to look at the ceiling. The sunlight illuminated the warehouse from a small hole on the roof. He then muttered to himself. System. Name. Level 203. EXP 2 100/2 030 000. Class. Right angle. Passive. Right angle. Right angle. Right angle. Right angle. Total skills. 203 of 203. Skill tab. Stats. Stat points available. 0. Right angle STR. SSS. Right angle MP. SSS plus. Right angle def. SS plus. Right angle AGI. SSS plus. Right angle int. SSS plus. Right angle charm. SSS plus. System shop. System coins. 2,300. Quests available. 84. Two bird with one stone. He clicked his tongue. Quests available. 84, 82. A few days had passed since the incident. It was Saturday, and the other class's battle royale session had come to an end. The entire incident made major headlines, especially because of Darwin's disappearance. Osborne Company was shut down, and all of the shift porters were recalled for investigation. All of the Osborne family members were hunted down and were called in for the time being. Several theories filled the internet. Articles regarding the incident and Darwin's whereabouts were being talked about. The Academy suffered severe backlash from the public, but was mitigated due to Evelyn's involvement in the incident. After Evelyn's arrival, Francis was quickly dispatched off with the assistance of the Special Force. Though it was an unofficial guild operation, Evelyn and Raina were sufficiently rewarded by the guild. Amy had to undergo counseling to check for any signs of mental trauma. She was then advised to take the treatment for 8 weeks. Brandon and Raven's involvement was omitted, as they were both still students. And Brandon, he slept like a log for most of the week. Asterisk. Whom. Brandon jolted awake with a deep yawn. What caught his attention was the enticing scent of food. Though the door to his room was closed, the smell still lingered in his room. He then got up and approached the door. Creak. As the door opened and he stepped out the living room, what met his line of sight was a familiar figure with long, pale white hair tied into a ponytail. She adorned casual clothing, but what caught Brandon's attention was the peach-colored apron extending in front of her. Morning. Good morning. Take a seat. Breakfast will be ready in a minute. Brandon unknowingly twitched as his eyes shot wide open, but instantly composed himself and replied, MHM, thanks. Brandon was familiar with this sight. For the past week, Belle had been giving him special attention ever since he returned from the incident. She was debriefed by Evelyn about Brandon's involvement, and because of that, Belle might have felt bad since their last conversation was an argument. She might have not thought that Brandon was serious about finding Amy. But of course, Brandon didn't mind the attention. Following the intense battle with Jean, Brandon's body throbbed with pain from mana burst. The extended use of accelerated cognition left him mentally and physically drained as well. In short, he was burnout. Sitting down, he turned his head to find Belle approaching the table while humming. Breakfast is ready. She wore oven mitts on both hands and carried a pot. Brandon could see smoke protruding from the pot. Belle placed the hot pot on the table and removed the lid. But the moment she did, Brandon secretly clenched his fist. Belle might have thought she was a good cook, but Brandon thought otherwise. Though the food's aroma was quite enticing, Brandon knew he shouldn't judge the taste because of the smell. Brandon was never picky with his food, but when it came to Belle's cooking, food is all he can say to himself. Belle flashed him a warm smile, as Brandon did the same, though an awkward one. But it seemed like Belle didn't notice as she continued to hum, removing the oven mitts. Before Belle turned around, Brandon secretly clasped his hands together and offered a silent prayer. Lord, if you can hear my prayers, please protect me. For the past week, it was the same morning for Brandon. But despite that, just the efforts of Belle to take care of him was enough to warm his heart. But then again, Belle and her food are two different things. It was a silent war for Brandon, a war between him and his stomach. Belle placed a bowl on the table in front of him, as she placed another one for herself. Belle seemed to notice Brandon's hesitation. What's the matter? Nothing. Thanks for breakfast as always. These were his true feelings. But what he was thanking her for was for the effort of cooking for him, not the food that she cooked. MHM, try it. At her instructions, Brandon hesitatingly grabbed the ladle and slowly poured the soup on his pot. But because his hands were shaky, some of the soup spilled on the table. Belle noticed once again, and a look of worry etched on her face. Be careful. You're still injured after all. It's true, he was injured, but it wasn't the reason why his hands shook. Yeah, sorry. Slowly pouring the soup on the bowl, some of the cut vegetables poured in as well. Though cut was an overstatement. It filled most of the bowl. This is an entire potato. He then lifted the bowl, secretly clenching his teeth. But before he drank the soup, he silently muttered to himself, I've survived way worse than this. HM, did you say something? No. At that, Brandon stopped breathing, blocking the senses of his nose, and drank the soup. Slurp. While he continued to drink, Belle spoke up with a smile. How is it? Good, right? Brandon continued to drink and gave her a thumbs up. It's way too salty. As he finished the soup down to the last drop, he turned his attention to Belle. Belle tried to taste her soup first before completely drinking it. Slurp, but to Brandon's horror, I think it needs more salt. Brandon's eyes shot wide open. Are her taste buds not working? Or does she even have one? And before he realized it, Belle was already reaching out for the salt container. At that moment, Brandon instantly activated Mana Burst and abruptly stopped Belle's hand. Uck! He inwardly groaned. What's wrong? It's good. Don't make it better. After all, he was still in pain, but he had no choice. It was the only way for him to stop the disaster that was about to ensue. As he gripped Belle's arm, she turned to look at him and tilted her head. What's wrong? It's good. Don't make it better. Okay. Brandon inwardly sighed. With all the battles he had fought, he could definitely say that Belle's food had to be the hardest enemy he had ever faced. At that, the two siblings continued to enjoy their morning, though it would be more accurate to say that only one of the siblings enjoyed it. As the two continued to converse, Belle dropped him a bombshell. By the way, Mom is coming. Brandon tilted his head. He seemed to have forgotten. That's right, Brandon Locke had parents. At that moment, Brandon started to panic. He didn't know how the old Brandon Locke would actually act around his family. He was quite lucky with Belle, as Belle didn't grow up with Brandon in his teenage years. And before he knew it, creak, the door creaked open and a figure emerged from the door. Surprise! Surprise! Turning towards the door, what met his line of sight was a woman with strikingly similar features to Belle. The only difference they had would be the woman's eyes. They were pitch black. Her name was Brianna, right? While Brandon pondered in his seat, Belle abruptly got up. Mom! She ran towards Brianna and locked her in a tight embrace as the woman did the same. My baby girl, good to see you. As the two continued to lock in an embrace, Brandon stayed seated in a daze. He didn't know how to approach her or how the original Brandon Locke would act around her. Unknowingly lost in his thoughts, Brianna called out for him. Brandon, why aren't you coming to greet your mother? Brandon abruptly stood up as well, albeit awkwardly. Brianna tilted her head, then turned to look at Belle. What's wrong with your brother? What about him? Belle seemed confused as well. After all, she didn't know about the original Brandon Locke during his teenage years. Brianna turned towards Brandon and pinched her chin. Something about him is different. I just can't quite put my finger on it. Brandon's body twitched at her words. Cold sweat protruded from his back, and he could feel his palms start to sweat. Trying to compose himself, Brandon slowly closed his eyes. Then, Mom, it's so good to see you two. With a smile on his face, he ran towards Brianna and joined the two's embrace. He closed his eyes and silently prayed that Brianna wouldn't find any suspicions anymore. And to his surprise, never mind. Brandon breathed a sigh of relief. He seemed to be safe, for now at least. After their greetings, the three walked towards the dining table and took a seat. Belle sat next to Brianna, while Brandon sat at the chair in the middle of the table. Belle pursed her lips and turned towards Brianna. So, what's with the sudden visit, Mom? Hee, I just want to see if my two kids are getting along. Belle leaned her elbow on the table as her hand supported her head. She then shifted her gaze towards Brandon and opened her mouth. He's quite different from back then, but we are getting along. After those words left Belle's mouth, Brianna turned her head to look at Brandon. He didn't seem that different when he greeted me, though. Yes, but lately he's been kind of aloof. Really? The two women stared directly at Brandon, who stayed silently seated. Brandon could feel his palms start to get sweatier by the second. Cold sweat started to bead from his forehead as well. In front of him, Brianna pinched her chin and continued to stare at him. Brandon's eyes started to dart around, trying to ease himself from attention. The woman's voice then reached his ears. I think he's just playing a character, probably from an anime he had recently watched. Belle chimed in as well. Her eyes widened as her tone raised. He was quite an otaku back then. They weren't far off. It seemed like the original Brandon and the current Brandon had quite the similar hobbies. Back in his old world, Brandon would agree that he was an avid otaku. But How did you reach that conclusion? Yes, it wasn't far off, but it was quite a stretch as well. Am I actually aloof? He didn't know, but from what he could recall from his previous interactions with the others, he realized that he had started speaking less ever since the party. He was now facing a dilemma, an identity crisis, but he knew the reason for his sudden change. The world. His experiences in this world were gradually changing him. PFF. He was quickly snapped out of his thoughts as a chuckle reached his ears. Gazing in front of him, the two women covered their mouths with their hands, trying to stop themselves from laughing. Belle removed her hands from her lips. She flashed him a smile as her lips parted to say, PFF, I haven't seen you make that face in a while. Brandon was taken aback. It seemed like the two women were poking fun at him. Not that he actually minded. He knew he needed this kind of atmosphere after everything that happened. Gazing in front of him, the two women had stopped their teasing, and Belle turned towards Brianna once again. But Mom, what are you really here for? Oh, like I said, I just wanted to see Dash. I know how busy you and Dad are. So what is this really about? Belle cut her off. At Belle's interrogation, Brianna retrieved her phone. She continuously clicked the screen and stood up. After finding whatever she was looking for, Brianna flashed her phone for both of the siblings to see. A smile etched on her face. Ta-da! For what Brandon could discern, her screen showed what seemed to be a room. Scanning the phone, Belle tilted her head. What are you trying to tell us? The two of you will be moving here. What for? This place isn't so bad. You've seen the news, right? As those words left Brianna's mouth, Belle quickly stole a glance at Brandon. She then shifted her gaze back to Brianna, who seemed to not have noticed it. Yeah, of course they've seen the news. The incident regarding Felix and the Osborne Company made waves on the internet after all. It wouldn't be too far-stretched to say that everyone knew about it. The world isn't a safe place anymore, and this apartment's security is quite lax. It was true. Despite being a lavish apartment complex, once you come outside, you'd be immediately greeted by the bustling part of the street. Brandon sat silent the whole time, observing the two. Belle seemed unconvinced. Maybe she had some sentimental value with the current place. Belle tilted her head once again. So, is that place any better? It's quite expensive, but as long as you two are safe, money isn't a problem. I see. I'll think about it. What's the name? I'll look it up. Brianna tapped her phone again, most likely checking for the apartment's name. She then raised her head and pursed her lips. Asami Complex. I forgot to mention, but it's quite close to the academy as well. At the mention of Asami, Brandon's eyes shot wide open. He knew just exactly what the building was. Or rather, who owned it. Brandon had immediately caught Belle and Brianna's attention, as they both locked their eyes. With him, Brianna tilted her head with a curious expression. Brandon? What's wrong? I think I know who owns that building. Laying on her bed, her pitch-black hair cascaded all over her pillow. Rachel blankly stared at her phone and breathed out a heavy sigh. Ever since the incident, the group chat's activity had significantly dwindled. The last message sent was from Reinhard. From Reinhard Van. 5 days ago. You guys heard what happened? What should we do? That was it. It was most likely because everyone decided to give Amy some space. Everyone had left the message on scene, all except for one person, Amy Ashfield. After Amy was saved, not once had she ever sent a single message in the group chat, not even a private message to her own sister, Rachel. This made Rachel uneasy. But regardless, there was nothing she could do. She couldn't force Amy to open up to her, which is why she decided to give her some time as well. She twisted her body sideways and breathed out another heavy sigh. With that being said, she decided to close her eyes. Her phone clasped in her hands. BRT. Yet as soon as she did, her phone buzzed. A notification. Could it finally be Amy? She decided to check. Click. But to her surprise, it was the first person she had least expected to contact her. From Brandon Locke. Are you free? Rachel tilted her head, puzzled. What does he want? After the battle royale, Brandon was the talk of the entire academy. His performance in the battle royale, following the reveal of being a tri-elemental mage, made him a popular topic for conversation. Rachel was astonished as well. But she knew Brandon had his secrets, and she respected that. Brandon must have had his reasons for hiding it in the beginning. But in the first place, only 3 weeks had elapsed since the start of the semester. So technically, he didn't really hide it. Though she was one of the first to have known Brandon in the friend group, they weren't particularly close. But she could definitely say that Brandon and Amy were quite close. After all, Amy had chosen him as her partner during the battle royale. So maybe, just maybe he knows something. Thus, she decided to reply back. Yes, I am. Could we meet up? An immediate reply. Truth be told, Rachel didn't feel like leaving her apartment at the moment. She was quite exhausted, both mentally and physically, due to the incident and her class being the last batch for the Battle Royale session, her partner being Reinhard. It goes without saying that they did in fact win. After all, they were both top-ranking students within the first-year students. Thus, they won, but without facing any difficulties. After Brandon's class, the other students opted to take the same strategy and teamed up with each other just to defeat the top 10 students. Which is why, though reluctantly, Rachel sent her reply. Could we do it in my place? I'll send the address. But as soon as she sent that, Brandon only left the message on scene. He must have been hesitant because Rachel immediately invited him over. But to her surprise, okay, thumbs up, PFT. Rachel stifled a chuckle at the last emoji he sent. It felt rather nonchalant for Rachel. Right, this is the kind of person he was. From her assessment, Brandon was quite aloof. Girls would surround him from time to time, but Brandon always paid no heed to it. She could definitely trust him to be alone with her in her apartment. In the first place, she was the one to have invited him in the first place. With that being said, Rachel got up and opted to take a shower. However, looking around, her place was quite a mess. An instant noodle cup on the floor. Manga comics were placed randomly. Energy drinks toppled everywhere on the floor. She wasn't a particularly messy person. She just wasn't good at cleaning. So the garbage would pile up eventually. At least, that's what she thinks. Guess I need to clean up, huh? This is the right place, right? As soon as Rachel sent the address, Brandon was flabbergasted. After all, this is the exact place we'll be moving in. In other words, they were about to become neighbors. What a coincidence. That was his only reaction. From a novel, he knew Rachel lived in her family's apartment complexes, but they had a lot of buildings. Who knew Rachel was actually living in the same building Brandon and Belle were about to move into? Asking to meet up with Rachel worked out to his advantage. He was quite reluctant with the idea, especially since he knew Rachel and Amy were siblings. Maybe Rachel wanted some space as well, or maybe she wanted company. He didn't know. Regardless, he had already sent the message, and it seemed like Rachel was up for it. It was a good opportunity to assess the apartment and maybe to gather some information about Amy. With that being said, Brandon decided to freshen up first. Asterisk. Arriving in the complex, Brandon could only describe it as a stark comparison to his previous place. The building stood tall, and the entrance was guarded by uniformed security personnel. Inside, the lobby had polished marble floors and stylish decor, while in front of him was the receptionist whose attention he had already caught. He was only allowed because specifically gave a code to enter. Brandon stayed seated in the couch lobby while waiting for Rachel, who seemed to be freshening up as well. After waiting for about an hour, a familiar figure emerged from the elevator. Her white nightgown completely highlighted her features as her pitch black hair cascaded around her shoulders. As soon as she stepped out, the staff immediately greeted her. "Good morning, Miss Rachel." Most of the staff greeted her the same, and Rachel would nod at them with a smile plastered on her face. As soon as she approached Brandon, he could feel several glances his way. No, he could definitely hear them murmuring. Did Miss Rachel invite that boy over? Oh my, she's all grown up now. But does her father know? Let the little miss keep a few secrets. You're just saying that because the boy is quite handsome. The boy is quite handsome. Bunch of nonsense. Brandon paid no heed to it, and it seemed like Rachel didn't hear them. Looking up at Rachel, her expression seemed cold, but her lips curled up a smile. But Brandon knew the cold maiden act was only on the surface. Rachel pursed her lips, and her voice reached Brandon's ears. Thanks for waiting, come. At her instructions, Brandon immediately got up and followed her to the elevator. Once again, he could feel several glances his way. Asterisk. Arriving in her room, Brandon was taken aback. This, from behind him, Rachel clasped her hands on her back and tilted her head. It took a while to clean, but I think I did a good job. Good job, huh? It seemed like she didn't even clean at all. There were stains all over the floor, while manga comics and light novels were all tucked in a corner. But Brandon could definitely see it. He paid it no mind since he knew Rachel was trying to hide that hobby of hers. Energy drinks were neatly arranged and situated in the corner, which was a plus. But in the first place, you're supposed to throw them out. Huh? Brandon let out a heavy sigh. He turned around and faced Rachel. Good job cleaning. I'll take it from here. Question mark. Seated on the couch, Rachel turned her head to look at Brandon, who was piling up all the trash. She had offered to help him, but Brandon would always refuse her. Rachel would just pout, but that was all on the surface. The cleaning service was free, and she definitely took advantage of it. Brandon was quite the good janitor. Clap, clap. With his usual stoic demeanor, Brandon dusted off his hands and placed his hands on his waist. Turning around, he locked his gaze with Rachel, who abruptly turned her head away. Foo, foo, foo. She tried to whistle, but the only sound she let out was air. Letting out a deep breath, Brandon made his way towards Rachel. Facing Brandon, she slightly bowed her head. Thank you. Brandon didn't respond and sat beside Rachel. She was quite alerted by his gesture, but instantly dismissed it. She knew Brandon wouldn't think twice about any of his actions. Thus, she turned to face him. Pursing her lips, she asked, Why did you decide to meet up? To clean up? Really? Yes. Just kidding. She was taken aback. Tilting her head, she pinched her chin and leaned close to him, thoroughly scanning Brandon's face. What are you doing? She didn't respond and continued to thoroughly scan every inch of his face. She then stopped and leaned back. Closing her eyes, she breathed out a sigh. What was that about? I tried to pay you back, but it didn't work. Question mark. It was a technique she had recently learned from romance manga to try and pay Brandon back for his joke. Leaning closer to a man's face would most likely fluster them. But for some reason, it didn't work on Brandon. Clearly, he doesn't know anything about women. Or maybe he did, and was already used to it. Maybe that's why his expressions didn't change. Or maybe he just didn't care. She was at a loss. Clearly, she needed to study more if she wanted to manipulate men with her charms. Or maybe I'm just not charming enough? No, there was definitely something wrong with Brandon. She then dismissed her thoughts and opened her mouth, keeping her usual cold maiden tone. Really, what's the purpose of this meetup? She turned her head towards Brandon. But the moment she did, her body twitched at the sudden phone that was shoved on her face. This, Brandon said, while shoving his phone directly to her face. Rachel leaned back and thoroughly scanned the contents on the screen, though she didn't understand what Brandon was trying to show her. What's this? Scroll up. Scrolling up, her curiosity was piqued. Asami Complex. But what are you showing me this for? Me and my sister are moving here. She tilted her head. Rachel didn't mind it, and the income would definitely go to her. After all, the Asami Complex branch where she was staying was legally under her name. In other words, it was Daddy's gift to his little princess. Though there was no point in meeting up just to apply for an apartment unit. Brandon could have just directly emailed the website. Did he need permission from her? He didn't need to do that. So what was the point of the meetup? Unless, before she could arrive at a conclusion, Brandon's voice reached her ears. Could you give us a discount? She tilted her head at Brandon's sudden bombshell. Is this why you cleaned my place? Of course, she could have just asked the staff to clean up for her. But she was advised not to do that by her father. And as if Brandon had read her mind, his voice reached her ears once again. Yes, that's why I cleaned up after you. How cunning. You can just pretend it's a service fee for the hard work I did. This man, she thought she was taking advantage of him. But in actuality, he was taking advantage of her. Brandon Locke. He's even better at this game than me. Closing her eyes, Rachel breathed out a heavy sigh. Fine. You're a friend after all. I'll give you a 10 purse dash. 50%. Before she could even finish, Brandon had already interrupted her, flexing 5 of his fingers in front of her. Eh, that's unfair. That's practically stealing. I have an offer you can't refuse to fill the other 40%. What is he? Looking around, Brandon's gaze landed on the trash bags placed on the corner of the door. He then turned his head and looked at her. I'll clean your place every week. It was a ridiculous offer. But nonetheless, Rachel was tempted. Truly, Brandon Locke was not a man to be underestimated. But if he was offering that much, she knew she had to take full advantage of it. She pursed her lips and stared at him with a serious expression. Every day, twice a week, 5 times a week, 3 times a week. Deal. Deal. The two eventually shook hands with serious expressions after coming to an agreement. For Rachel, it was a business opportunity. For Brandon, he was probably scamming her, but she didn't mind it. Brandon would become her personal janitor, while at the same time extorting money from their rent. Rachel could agree that she had won the battle. As she was lost in her thoughts, Brandon changed the topic. Any news about Amy? All right. Due to the entire ordeal, Rachel had forgotten her worries about Amy. She stared down with a sad expression. She's still taking counseling. She hasn't replied to any of my texts. Brandon looked away and spoke with an understanding tone. I see. For now, everyone's giving her space. Hopefully we'll see her at the academy on Monday. Yeah. At that, Rachel remembered. Since Brandon was there during Amy's kidnapping, albeit inside the battle royale, maybe. He knew something. Lifting her head, she turned towards Brandon, who was blankly staring at the ceiling. Do you know anything? Brandon looked at her and tilted his head. Why are you asking me? Never mind. Right? Even if Brandon was there on that day, in the end, he was still a student. He couldn't have known about Amy's current circumstances. If anyone were supposed to know, it should have been Rachel, Amy's twin sister. The mood seemed to start getting gloomy. Realizing, Brandon stood up. I should go now, right? Walking towards the door, Brandon paused and turned his head. If you need anything else, call me. MHM. Acknowledging, Brandon opened the door. But before he left, Rachel remembered to ask him something. By the way, which room did you get? Before Brandon answered, he retrieved his phone and scanned the contents. Scrolling up, Brandon turned to glance at Rachel once more. Room 29. That's... Before Rachel could finish, Brandon turned his attention towards the room number on the door in front of him. 29. So that means the rooms were directly in front of each other. In other words, they would soon become door-to-door neighbors. Walking around the halls of the academy, her golden blonde hair was deeply tucked inside her cap. The tip of the cap was adjusted down to better cover her features. Glancing down at her watch, Amy realized she was late. No, she was late on purpose. She was conflicted if she should go to the academy or not, but she decided to go anyway. The further she delayed it, the more attention she would receive once she returned. She breathed out a sigh. Due to the incident, she was forced to undergo counseling. She had told the therapist that she was fine and there was no need for the treatment. Yet her mother would say otherwise. This peeved Amy so. She then retrieved her phone. On her phone showed the app for the group chat. She could see that there was a red icon with the number 167 on it, indicating the amount of messages she had received in the past week. She had avoided all of her friends, thinking they would react similarly to her mother, which is why she had never replied to any of their text messages. She didn't want to be pitted just because of the incident. She currently adorned a disguise particularly cap, just so she could enter the lecture room without attracting unwanted attention. But despite her best efforts, she had still gathered the attention from the professors she would pass by. As soon as it happens, she would instantly shake her head, letting them understand that she didn't want them to approach her. They would eventually nod in understanding and leave her alone. Continuing to walk, she had finally reached the lecture room. Peeking, the lecture had already started, but she was already aware of it. I should have just skipped today instead. She breathed out a sigh. Tap, tap. Suddenly, she felt Sonyeon tapping on her shoulders, alerting her in result. Turning around, what met her line of sight were 2 purple eyes who looked at her in confusion. Amy. Amy stifled an awkward laugh while waving her hand at Claire. Hi, Claire. Recognizing, Claire abruptly jumped Amy and embraced her tightly. Uck, good to see you, T-Dash. I was so worried. You haven't been replying to my or Rachel's texts. As Claire's tone rose, Amy warmly smiled, returning the embrace. Her actions of avoiding them had caused them to be anxious. If there's anything that peeved Amy, it would be the sheer act of pitying her, just like what her mother did. But to her surprise, Claire didn't do that. Claire pulled away from the hug and locked her gaze with Amy. I know you don't want to talk about what happened, so I won't mention it. But since you're safe now, please don't avoid us. We care about you. At Claire's words, Amy looked down with a sorrowful expression. She then lifted her head up and pursed her lips. Thank you and sorry. There's no need to apologize. I'm just happy that you're safe. Claire warmly smiled as Amy returned it with a smile of her own. Peeking inside the lecture room, Claire turned around and looked at Amy. Come on, the attention might be suffocating, but bear with it. It's understandable. Yeah. But don't worry. If they make you uncomfortable, I'll intervene. Amy nodded at Claire's words. Okay, thanks. MHM. At that, the two beckoned inside the lecture room. Womp. Seated in his seat, Brandon stifled a yawn. He had stayed up all night due to the process of moving into the new apartment. Not only that, but he was quite bored of the lecture. For the past hour or so, the professor continued to discuss about history, things that Brandon already knew. Yes, this was history class. His memories were quite vivid about the world's history, which is why Brandon had studied it. In advance, during his time as Sami bookstore, he leaned down, crossing his arms on the table. While he did so, he could feel several glances his way. Ever since he came back to the academy, wherever he went, he would often catch the students' attention. Their murmurs would often reach his ears, not like they were trying to keep it quiet. From what he could recall, they would say things like, Is that him? Kaya. It's Brandon Locke. Hey, look, it's the Tri-Elemental Mage. He's even more handsome than on screen. It was non-verbatim. Brandon could more or less make out what they said. Brandon would often ignore them and let out a sigh in return. He had already expected the attention, ever since his performance in the Battle Royale. But due to the lack of sleep, the attention irritated him to a certain degree. It would often happen during the current lecture as well. Whatever he did, he could feel several glances his way. He breathed out a heavy sigh. Though, it wasn't just him receiving the attention. Glancing at his side was Raven, who was enthusiastically listening to the lecture. Raven had received quite the attention as well due to his own performance. Despite Brandon winning the entire Battle Royale, it was Raven who had the most kills. Truth be told, two factions had formed. What once was a duelist versus mage faction had turned into a Raven versus Brandon faction. They would often debate about who was the real ranked one student of the first years. To a certain degree, this had helped alleviate some of the discrimination among the duelists. There were some duelists that supported Brandon, while there were some mages who supported Raven. The Academy should thank us for this. Resting his elbow on the table, he propped his head up with his hand. Feeling drowsy, his eyelids had started to close, but would fight the urge to sleep. I should just nap for a while. There's no point in listening to the lecture anyway. Following that line of thought, Brandon leaned down on the table and closed his eyes. Ugh! But as soon as he did, he was jolted awake as one of the students panicked. Brandon's passed out. Someone save him. Quickly, call the nurse. Even the professor chimed in and abruptly put his lecture on pause. Brando CKE's passed out. S is an emergency. As their screams continued to reach his ears, Brandon lifted his head up in a daze. Glancing, the professor's voice reached his ears. Brandon Locke, are you all right? What happened? Nothing, just sleepy. You had us worried for a second. It's fine, you can sleep. Really? Yes, don't let my lecture bother you now. Okay. One of the students chimed in as well. I'm sleepy too, Professor. Can I sleep as well? No. A flat-out refusal. It seemed like it was a privilege only for Brandon and Brandon alone. Or maybe Raven too, but he was a good student. Brandon just shrugged and leaned down on the table once more, closing his eyes. From behind him, he could hear a chuckle. PFT. Noticing, Brandon peered one of his eyes open to trace the source of the chuckle. What met his sight was Rachel, who covered her mouth, struggling to hold back her laugh. And as soon as she noticed his gaze, she instantly looked away, removing her hand from her lips and tried to whistle. Foot, foot, foot. Again, the only sound Brandon could hear was wind. Once again, he leaned down on the table to close his eyes. Yet he was interrupted once again by Raven, who was showing his notebook for some reason. Hey, Brandon, what do you think about my notes, Dash? Huh? Please. Okay. The world, nothing but darkness. Like an abyss. It was silent and dark. All Brandon could see was nothing but an empty world. Vast darkness. Silence. It was peaceful. Then suddenly, a figure emerged. Pale white hair, ice blue eyes looking back at him. Brandon. Locke. It was him, yet at the same time it wasn't. Suddenly, the figure blurred out. The scene abruptly changed. Question mark. Brandon couldn't comprehend what was happening. He was just in the academy, supposedly taking history class. But the next second he was in a room he was quite familiar with. No, it was the same room that he had from the previous apartment. But how am I there? A figure that looked identical to Brandon Locke laid on the bed. Yet Brandon was standing on the corner of the bed, looking down at the figure. A vision? This doesn't make any sense. This was the first time it had happened to him. Creak. The door creaked open and another figure emerged. A figure that was quite blurry to him. The figure entered the room as Brandon just stood still, looking at the figure. He couldn't make out who the person that entered the room was, but he was certain about one thing. So, it can't see me. He was intangible. The figure just phased through him. It stood up, peering down at the other Brandon that seemed to be sleeping. Brandon? A muffled voice, yet Brandon wasn't sure where it was coming from. Suddenly, the figure lifted its hand, its palms facing down at the other Brandon. Brandon? Hey! The muffled voice rang again, but Brandon's attention was solely focused on the figure. With the figure's hand lifted, it seemed to be chanting something. Yet Brandon couldn't hear what it was saying. Brandon? Still muffled. Brandon paid no heed to it, trying to read the figure's lips to make out what it was saying. He couldn't tell. He could deduce that it wasn't English. But suddenly, the figure's hands started to glow. Marks that seemed to be runic symbols etched on the figure's arms gradually glowed. Boy, Brandon, wake up! The glow started getting brighter, and at the same time, the other Brandon started glowing as well. A magic circle materialized, hovering above the other sleeping Brandon. 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers, 5, 8, 10. A total of 10 magic circle layers materialized, hovering above the other Brandon. What's wrong with him? I don't know. More muffled voices. But Brandon couldn't discern them anymore as his attention was fixated at the sight before him. What the fuck is going on? Rumble. Rumble. The entire room started to shake. But due to Brandon's intangibility, he couldn't feel the vibrations. Suddenly, the other Brandon's eyes started to glow a pure white hue. Creak. The door behind him creaked open again. It seemed like another figure entered the room. Realizing, Brandon abruptly turned around. But just as the figure started to enter his peripheral view, Wyack, he was jolted awake. Brandon, the voice reached his ears, but his thoughts were too occupied with the vision. Bah, thump, bah, thump. He could feel his heartbeat quicken. Ha, ha. Taking deep, heavy breaths, Brandon tried to calm down. The vision was etched in his memory. Everything felt vivid. He was unsure about what he just saw. He knew it wasn't a memory. But could it have been the original Brandon Locke's memory? No, that didn't seem to be the case. After all, he saw the other Brandon Locke laying down on the bed with his eyes closed. Then, whose memory was it? Or was it a vision? A hallucination? He took deep, heavy breaths again, as his heart rate started to stabilize. Drip, drip. A wet sensation dripped down from his nose. Realizing, he touched it. As he removed his hand from his nose, he looked at his fingers. His eyes shot wide open when he realized his fingers were stained red. Brandon, in a daze, Brandon looked up to find Raven, tilting his head at him. Beside Raven was Reinhard and Rachel, looking at him with a worried expression. Brandon, your nose, Dash. It's bleeding. Before Raven could finish, Rachel leaned forward and wiped Brandon's nose with a handkerchief. Brandon didn't respond. His eyes were wide open as he looked down at his fingers. Wiping his bloody nose, Rachel's worried voice reached his ears. What happened? I don't know. There was something clearly wrong with him. Looking up, he could see Rachel's face up close, and before he could react, she pressed her hand against his head. Exclamation point. You're burning up. Your complexions are quite pale as well. After her assessment, she took both of her hands away and took another handkerchief to wipe. The other hand. After wiping her hand, Brandon glanced down at her handkerchief, only to find that there was a wet stain on it. Realizing, he pressed his hand on the side of his head and felt a wet sensation. He was sweating, a cold sweat. Pinching his forehead, he tried to calm down. What the hell is going on with me? As his senses gradually returned, Brandon began to feel the onset of fatigue. His inside started heating up and his stomach started churning. His entire body was soaked in sweat. He could feel his shirt sticking to his body. Could it have been because of mana burst? It was a plausible theory, but he instantly dismissed it. It had already been a week since his fight with Jean. It wouldn't make sense if he was still suffering the backlash from the overuse of his skills. But he was unsure. If he wanted answers, there was only one person he could ask. Jean. Abruptly standing up, Brandon immediately headed for the exit. Rachel was surprised and tried to follow him as Raven and Reinhard did so as well. From behind him, Rachel, Raven, and Reinhard's voice reached his ears. Brandon, where are you going? Slow down. Oi. But Brandon paid no heed to their worries and tried to retrieve his phone. After he did, he turned around to meet their gazes. With a phone in his hand, he pursed his lips. I'm fine. I'll go to the nurse's office. You guys don't need to follow me. The three seemed hesitant to believe him, but eventually nodded with a worried expression and did not press further. As Brandon was about to leave, he turned around once again. And Rachel. At his call, Rachel turned around and met his gaze. Question mark. Thanks. Rachel seemed taken aback, but eventually nodded with a smile plastered on her face. Turning around, Brandon beckoned for the nurse's office, but instantly took a detour after. Their figures were nowhere to be seen. Ha! Ha! With each step he took, he felt his breath grow heavier. Bah! Thump! Bah! Thump! The sound of his heartbeat rang in his head. Looking down, his legs started to shake. Because of that, he decided to pause, using the wall to support himself. Fuck is going on? Glancing around, it seemed like no one was around. Realizing that the coast was clear, Brandon scrolled his contact list and immediately clicked. On Alpha. Ring, ring, click. Jean, I thought I told you to wait for 3. Yeah. There's something wrong with me. That's not my problem. You're the only one I can ask. I'll hear you out then. Brandon decided to tell him about his symptoms. From his pale complexions, the nose bleeding, the fatigue, the stomach churning, to how his body felt weak. The only part he omitted was about the vision that he had. He was quite unsure if it had any connections to his current predicament. And in the first place, Jean wouldn't understand anyway. After he finished explaining, Jin's voice rang. That. Do you know what it is? Yeah, but Evelyn can probably explain it better. I'm too lightheaded to find her, just tell me. Just tell her these exact 2 words. But after this, don't call me again unless it's about that. Yeah, now tell me. Mana poisoning. Click.